Watch closely, because this is how countries die. Not in explosions or nuclear war, but through slow failure, corruption, climate, incompetence, civil war, and eventually silence. Advanced AI systems processing vast amounts of intelligence data, strategic forecast, and expert analysis from defense analysts worldwide have identified 7 countries facing potential collapse by next year. Not decades from now, not in a far-off dystopia, but 2026. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Venezuela. These aren't just struggling nations, they're powder kegs, each with its own trigger: a failed war, a broken economy, a brutal dictatorship, a climate catastrophe. In this video, we'll walk through how each one could fall and why no one is ready for what happens next. This isn't fiction, it's the future, based on real-world data, real geopolitical pressure points, and predictive modeling that doesn't lie. The world map might look very different in 12 months. Welcome to the age of collapsing nations. But before we begin, the patterns reveal something chilling. One of these countries will lose control of its nuclear arsenal. Another will start a war that destroys its own regime. A third will simply stop existing as a functioning state. The data won't tell us which is which, but the trajectories are clear. Let's start with the most immediate nuclear threat. Something's happening in North Korea, and it's making intelligence agencies nervous. Late 2025 brought reports of unusual activity at nuclear sites across the Hermit Kingdom. Construction, movement, signals, intelligence picking up chatter that doesn't match normal patterns. Then, in August, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made a public statement that sent shockwaves through Seoul and Washington. The security environment requires North Korea to rapidly expand its nuclear armament. He said something else, too. It is a fait accompli that a war can break out at any time on the Korean peninsula. Not could, can. That's not posturing, that's a threat. By September, Western intelligence confirmed a secret missile base near the northern border with China, just 17 miles from the frontier. Satellite imagery shows the Sinpungdong facility can store up to 9 nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missiles, along with their mobile launchers. The Federation of American Scientists estimates North Korea has produced enough fissile material for up to 90 nuclear warheads. They've likely assembled around 50. But here's what analysts noticed that most experts missed. It's not just about the nukes, it's about what happens when the man controlling them disappears. Kim Jong-un is in his early 40s with persistent health issues, weight fluctuations, prolonged absences, cardiovascular concerns. His father died suddenly of a heart attack at 69, his grandfather at 82. Heart problems run in the family. And if Kim dies tomorrow, there's no clear successor. His children are minors. His sister, Kim Yo-young, wields significant power, but it's unclear if the military would accept her leadership. The analysis shows 2 pathways to collapse. Neither is survivable for the regime. First, Kim launches a provocation that spirals beyond his control. Maybe a tactical nuclear test, maybe an attack on a South Korean target. But this time, with his expanded arsenal, he miscalculates the response. South Korea's defense ministry has been explicit. If North Korea ever uses nuclear weapons, the Kim Jong-un regime will face its end. A full-scale war would be catastrophic, but the North Korean military cannot match the combined might of the US and South Korea. Within days, Kim's regime would be obliterated. The second pathway is quieter but equally chaotic: Kim's sudden death. No designated heir, no transition plan, competing factions scrambling for control. Purges have made the top brass paranoid. Kim executed his own uncle and half-brother. Trust is non-existent. If the regime fractures, the Hermit Kingdom doesn't open gradually, it shatters. Masses fleeing towards China and South Korea, nuclear materials unaccounted for, regional powers scrambling for secure weapons before they fall into the wrong hands. What does this mean for you? If North Korea collapses chaotically, expect immediate global market volatility. South Korea, home to Samsung, Hyundai, LG, could see production disrupted for months. Your next phone, Your next car could cost significantly more. And the refugee crisis? China and South Korea would face millions of desperate people crossing borders, destabilizing the entire region. But North Korea isn't the only nuclear powder keg on the verge of detonation. There's another regime where the countdown has already begun, and the clock is ticking faster than anyone realizes. Tehran, 2025. Protests flare up almost weekly. Women burning hijabs. Students chanting in the streets. Security forces responding with tear gas, beatings, arrests. The Woman Life Freedom Uprising in 2022 showed the regime something terrifying. People aren't afraid anymore. Its analysts didn't focus on street protests when calculating Iran's collapse probability. They focused on uranium, specifically enrichment levels at Iranian nuclear facilities, crossing red lines week after week, grams becoming kilograms, low enriched uranium becoming high enriched, slowly approaching weapons grade. Israel has been watching every centrifuge spin. U.S. intelligence tracking every shipment, every technical advancement, every threshold crossed. And in mid-2025, renowned economist Nouriel Roubini made a prediction that captured what intelligence agencies had been quietly discussing for months: regime collapse in Iran following the U.S. bombardment of the country's nuclear facilities was likely in the near future. Not possible, likely. Strategic analysts calculated something even more specific. There's a 12-day window. 12 days between when Israel decides Iran has crossed the final red line and when the Islamic Republic ceases to exist as a centralized state. Here's how it unfolds. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the elite force meant to hold everything together, has been Israel's primary target for years. IRGC commanders assassinated in Damascus. IRGC facilities bombed in Syria. Intelligence operations penetrating deep into Tehran. By 2025, Israel analysts were writing that Iran was teetering on the brink of collapse. Internal power struggles, economic catastrophe, popular discontent reaching critical mass. The regime's aura of invincibility built over 47 years was cracking. But the regime still had its nuclear program, the one thing that commanded respect, fear, international attention. And then projections show in 2026, Iran enriches uranium to weapons grade and begins preparing for a possible nuclear test. Israel cannot allow it. The United States cannot allow it. So they launch what intelligence circles are calling the 12-day war. Massive airstrikes across Iran, B-2s, F-35s, and F-15s hitting nuclear enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow. Cruise missiles and bunker busters targeting IRGC bases. Intelligence operations sabotaging command structures. Within 72 hours, Iran's nuclear program is crippled. IRGC infrastructure is decimated. The supreme leader's authority, built on strength and divine mandate, is shattered by military humiliation. And that's when the real cascade begins. Day 13. Mass protests explode across Tehran, Mashhad, Isfahan, Tabriz. Not thousands, millions. The people sense weakness like blood in the water. Elements of Iran's own security forces begin to fracture. Some units join the protesters, others flee. Still others hunker down in their barracks, waiting to see who wins. Within 2 weeks, the 47-year-old Islamic Republic is in free fall. Israeli intelligence warned that the downfall could lead to internal power struggles or even civil war between rival factions. Reformist, monarchist, ethnic separatist, and hardline Islamist militias all scramble for power in the vacuum. For global energy markets, Iran's collapse means immediate chaos. Iran produces about 3 million barrels of oil per day. Remove that from global supply during a civil war, and oil prices could spike 40 to 50%. Your gas prices? Expect them to double within weeks. 2 nuclear flashpoints, both teetering on the edge. But if you think regional powers collapsing is the worst-case scenario, you haven't seen what's happening to the superpower everyone thought was invincible. Something strange started happening in Russian cities in late 2024. Obituaries, lots of them. Local newspapers in small Siberian towns in the Far East in rural regions filled with death notices. Young men, 20-somethings, 30s, entire generations disappearing into the war machine. By 2025, you couldn't hide it anymore. In September, the BBC Russian service, working with Mediazona and volunteers, confirmed the deaths of 128,115 Russian soldiers by name. Between June and August alone, they recorded 23,305 new death notices, up to 420 per day, nearly triple the 2024 average. Ukrainian intelligence released official Russian military loss statistics for just the first 8 months of 2025. 281,550 personnel lost. By October, total Russian casualties since February 2022 had surpassed 1.1 million. More Russian soldiers have died in 3.5 years in Ukraine than in Afghanistan, Chechnya, and every other conflict since 1945 combined. But battlefield losses tell only part of the story. What analysts discovered goes deeper. By 2025, local governments across Russia were cutting civil servant salaries by 30 to 50%. Some cities couldn't afford to keep streetlights on. Hidden beneath official budgets, $9 trillion in local government debt, more than the combined GDP of Japan and Germany. Local government financing vehicles started defaulting in 2023. By 2025, it was happening regularly. The Russian state was quietly hemorrhaging at the municipal level. But here's a third dimension that terrifies strategists even more. Russia isn't one nation. It's 21 autonomous republics, each with its own ethnic identity, language, and historical grievances. Dagestan, Chechnya, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Buryatia, Tuvia. And the casualty analysis revealed something explosive. Ethnic minorities from these regions were dying at disproportionately high rates. Buryats, Tuvans, Chechens, recruited heavily, paid well by local standards, sent to the front lines, and killed in massive numbers. What happens when those regions realize they're being used as cannon fodder for Moscow's war? In 2026, a catastrophic military defeat. Not just a tactical setback, a humiliating regime-threatening collapse on the battlefield. Competing factions in Moscow turn on each other. The military blames the intelligence services. The intelligence services blame the National Guard. Wagner-style militias operate independently, loyal to commanders, not to the Kremlin. Violence becomes real, armed clashes, purges and counter-purges. And in that chaos, the ethnic republics see their moment. Not gradual succession, simultaneous declarations of sovereignty across a dozen regions. Russia doesn't fracture into 2 or 3 pieces, it shatters into dozens. Analysts grimly call this the sick man of Eurasia scenario, a nuclear-armed state fragmenting in real time with 5,500 nuclear warheads scattered across a collapsing empire. One strategic forecast warned that if Putin's war enters its 5th year in 2027, Russia's personnel vulnerability will go from critical to breakdown, driving Russia toward leadership-driven collapse. For the global economy, Russia's collapse means immediate disruption to fertilizer supplies, 13% of global production, grain exports, and natural gas to Europe. Wheat prices could surge 60 to 80%, making bread, pasta, and basic staples significantly more expensive worldwide. 3 nuclear powers on the brink, but nuclear weapons aren't the only existential threat facing humanity. There's something else brewing in South Asia, a perfect storm where climate, chaos, and instability converge. 2022. Unprecedented floods submerge a third of Pakistan. Over 1,700 people died, 33 million affected. Once-in-a-century disaster. 2025, it happened again. Since June 2025, Pakistan has faced devastating monsoon floods that claimed nearly 1,000 lives, displaced over 2.5 million people, destroyed more than 8,400 houses, and submerged 2.2 million hectares of cropland. Wheat flour prices jumped 25% in the first week of September. The World Bank issued a stark warning. Climate shocks are the single biggest threat to Pakistan's macroeconomic stability. But trend analysis didn't predict another flood would destroy Pakistan. It predicted what comes after. The country contributes less than 1% of global greenhouse emissions, yet a 2025 global assessment found Pakistan more vulnerable to climate change than any other nation. But climate alone doesn't collapse countries. Pakistan ranks 144th out of 163 countries on the Global Peace Index, second in the world on the Global Terrorism Index. The Pakistani Taliban, TTP, has been growing stronger. Balak separatists launching attacks, sectarian militias everywhere. The state's authority barely extends beyond major cities. The convergence is clear. Climate catastrophe plus state failure plus extremism equals systemic collapse. Here's the sequence. Mid-2026, severe drought follows the 2025 floods. Crops fail, livestock die. Water sources dry up. Famine hits remote provinces, Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, rural Sindh. The government, paralyzed by dead and infighting, fails to organize adequate food distribution. Food riots explode in Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad. Police firing into crowds, chaos spreading. But in rural areas, something different happens. The Pakistani Taliban and militant groups step in, providing food aid, offering protection, filling the vacuum left by a collapsing state. District by district, government authority evaporates. By late 2026, Islamabad's writ doesn't extend beyond the capital. The military splits into factions or stages a coup but cannot stabilize the country. Multiple simultaneous insurgencies, Balak separatists, Taliban-aligned militants, sectarian violence. And here's what makes Pakistan's collapse a global crisis. Pakistan has nuclear weapons, an estimated 170-plus warheads. In a fragmenting state where multiple armed groups are fighting for control and no one knows who's in charge of the arsenal. For you, this means potential nuclear terrorism becomes a realistic threat for the first time since the Cold War. Insurance costs for major cities worldwide would skyrocket. International travel would face unprecedented security measures. 3 nuclear powers are crumbling. There's a fourth crisis unfolding, one so quiet the world has already stopped watching. August 2021. The world watched Afghanistan fall. Every news channel, every headline, desperate scenes at Kabul airport. August 2025. The world stopped watching. But the data collection didn't stop, and what it revealed is worse than war. 29 million Afghans need humanitarian aid. Over 2/3 of the population, with 15 million facing acute food insecurity. Afghanistan has endured its 3rd consecutive year of drought, crops decimated, livestock dying, wells running dry. The Taliban regime cannot feed its people. A UN official made a blunt assessment. The Taliban depend on the UN and they know it. They can't feed the population. Only 2% of the population is getting enough to eat. At least 1 in 3 children is malnourished. The head of the World Food Program in Kabul warned, "We're on the brink of catastrophe." But there's no dramatic rescue coming. Foreign aid is dwindling. Donor fatigue, Taliban restrictions on women working for NGOs, international priorities shifting elsewhere. Afghanistan is starving in silence. Winter 2025-26, the harshest yet. Food supplies run out in remote provinces. By spring 2026, tens of thousands are dead from hunger and disease. Not soldiers, not militants, families, children, the elderly. Communities rebel for survival. In the north, former Northern Alliance fighters take up arms again. The Islamic State Khorasan launches attacks on Taliban positions, recruiting from desperate villages. Provincial Taliban commanders start acting independently, making deals with local warlords just to secure food. Afghanistan doesn't become a failed state, it becomes a collection of starving fiefdoms. Millions try to flee toward Pakistan, which is already collapsing, toward Iran, emerging from war, toward Central Asia, which closes its borders. For the global heroin trade, Afghanistan's collapse means chaos. The country produces 80% of the world's opium. Complete state failure means no regulation. Drug cartels would have direct access to poppy fields, potentially flooding Western cities with cheap heroin. Afghanistan won't collapse from bombs. It'll collapse from silence, from the world looking away while an entire nation starves. 4 crises, all accelerating. but none compared to what happens if the world's most populous nation miscalculates just once. Beijing 2025, gleaming skyscrapers, military parades, shows of force in the Taiwan Strait. To the world, China looks unstoppable, but analysts see cracks spreading beneath the surface. Economic growth slowing under crushing debt, demographic catastrophe, aging population, collapsing birth rates, real estate bubble imploding, erasing trillions in middle-class wealth. Youth unemployment got so bad that China stopped publishing the numbers in mid-2023. When they resumed with a new methodology, the rate had somehow dropped from 21.3% to 14.9%. But economic problems alone don't collapse superpowers. The real trigger is Taiwan. U.S. intelligence assessment. Xi Jinping has directed the People's Liberation Army to be prepared for a potential invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Admiral Samuel Paparo testified before Congress, China's drills around Taiwan are not just exercises, they are rehearsals. By 2024, Chinese military activity near Taiwan had increased 300%. New roll-on, roll-off ferries built that can transform into military transport, amphibious assault training, stockpiling of military supplies in coastal provinces. Everything pointing to one conclusion: invasion window 2026-2027. But what if Taiwan doesn't fall in days like Xi expects? China's military has never fought a modern war. The PLA's last major combat was the 1979 invasion of Vietnam, which went poorly. Chinese officers suffer from the five incapables: critiques that they cannot judge situations, understand authorities' intentions, make operational decisions, deploy troops, or handle unexpected situations. Mock battles, parades, exercises, but no combat. One Chinese dissident warned, there is neither the possibility nor the mechanism for gradual transformation, and collapse is therefore its destiny. When crisis hits, it hits hard. Here's the scenario: 2026. China launches its invasion, expecting swift victory, 72 hours maximum. Instead, fierce resistance. U.S. and allied forces intervene with overwhelming force. Japanese bases launch aircraft. South Korea allows airspace use. The Seventh Fleet engages. The invasion bogs down, landing craft destroyed, air superiority contested, tens of thousands of PLA soldiers dead within a week. Humiliating military defeat. The Chinese Communist Party's aura of infallibility, built over 75 years, shatters. Economic woes become unbearable. Factories close, markets crater, banks freeze accounts. Mass protest across Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou, Chengdu. But Xi's system has no safety valve, no way to let off pressure, no parliament, no independent judiciary, no free press. Just repression or capitulation. If repression fails, the whole system collapses at once. Factions turn on Xi. Military units receive conflicting orders. Regional commanders act independently. If a crisis hits this system, it hits hard. There is no gradual decline, only abrupt upheaval. China, with 1.4 billion people, descends into internal conflict. For you, this means your iPhone might not get manufactured. Medications, 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China, might become unavailable. Rare earth minerals essential for electric cars and military equipment would vanish. The global economy would plunge into depression that makes 2008 look minor. 6 nations teetering, but there's one more, one that's been dying so long people forgot it was still breathing. Venezuela's economy has shrunk 80% since 2014. More than 7.7 million people have fled, over 20% of the population. Nicolás Maduro clings to power through military loyalty, repression, and support from Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. The 2024 presidential election was so blatantly rigged that even Venezuela's neighbors condemned it. Oil revenue remains vulnerable. The military, once paid in dollars, now receives wages in worthless bolivars. How many more months can this last? 2026. Oil prices fall or sanctions tighten. The government can no longer pay security forces. Massive demonstrations erupt, the largest since 2019. A military faction revolts. Mid-level officers, tired of watching families starve while Maduro's circle lives in luxury, launches a coup. clashes in Caracas, loyalists versus rebel forces. Russia and China, watching from afar, decide intervention isn't worth it. Within weeks, Maduro flees or is arrested. Jubilant Venezuelans celebrate the end of 2 decades of socialist rule. But challenges are enormous. Malnourished population, crumbled infrastructure. The oil industry needs billions just to restart. Analysts assert that Maduro's end is near. The confluence of internal collapse and external pressure will force change by 2026. For the United States, Venezuela's collapse means one consequence: a massive refugee surge. Experts estimate 2 to 3 million more Venezuelans could flee in the first 6 months, heading through Central America toward the U.S. southern border. 7 countries on 7 different paths to collapse: North Korea, nuclear gamble; Iran, regional war; Russia, slow fragmentation; Pakistan, climate catastrophe; Afghanistan, silent starvation; China, superpower miscalculation; Venezuela, authoritarian implosion. These aren't wild predictions. They're extrapolations from intelligence assessments, military analyses, economic indicators, climate models. War, climate, tyranny, economic failure. None of these regimes are reforming fast enough. History teaches us that empires collapse suddenly after one shock too many. We're watching those shocks accumulate in real time. Billions of lives affected, nuclear security threatened, global economy disrupted, refugee crises on unprecedented scales, supply chains shattered, food prices spiking. The world map could be redrawn by the end of 2026. Can any of these regimes change course, or are we just waiting for the first domino to fall? Which country do you think goes down first? North Korea's nuclear gamble? Russia's slow death? China's Taiwan disaster? Pakistan's climate catastrophe? Let us know in the comments. And subscribe to Fall of Nations, because if 2026 becomes the year of collapsing nations, you'll want to understand exactly how we got here. The age of stable empires is over. Welcome to the age of volatility. The map is already changing. We just haven't redrawn it yet. There are 5 countries so feared, so brutal, so twisted in their actions that deep down, you wouldn't mind seeing them go up in flames. From weaponized surveillance and genocide to nuclear threats and hacked elections, these regimes have pushed the world to the edge. But what if we told you their collapse has already begun? Right now, the cracks are forming, economies unraveling, armies defecting, rebellions rising. These aren't theories, they're happening in real time. And if these regimes fall, the world won't be safer, it could explode. Because when tyrants lose control, they don't surrender, they strike back. This isn't just about revenge or justice, this is about survival. This kind of in-depth geopolitical storytelling is exactly why we created Fall of Nations. If you're interested in more content like this and want to support the mission, consider subscribing. Now, let's take a closer look at the 5 so-called evil empires on the brink of collapse. China, the surveillance superpower. China wants you to believe it's unstoppable, the second largest economy on Earth, 1 billion+ citizens marching in lockstep, a technological powerhouse ready to dominate the 21st century. But behind the gleaming skyscrapers and high-speed trains lies a different reality. Xi Jinping has created the most sophisticated surveillance state in human history. In Xinjiang alone, over 1 million Uyghurs have been detained in what UN investigators have called crimes against humanity. Facial recognition cameras track citizens' every move. Social credit scores determine who can travel, get loans, or even send their children to good schools. The Great Firewall blocks information the regime doesn't want its people to see. But the system that was meant to protect China's ruling elite is starting to crack. In 2024, China's property sector, which accounts for nearly 30% of its GDP, continued its catastrophic implosion. 90 million empty apartments now threaten to wipe out the life savings of hundreds of millions of Chinese families. The numbers are staggering. According to Statista, Chinese household wealth tied to real estate sits at 70%, compared to just 25% in America. When those investments collapse, so will public faith in the Communist Party. But the housing crisis is just the beginning.
China's birth rate has fallen to a record low of 6.77 births per 1,000 people, less than half the rate needed for population replacement. Despite abandoning the one-child policy, young Chinese couples simply aren't having babies. Housing costs are too high, education is too expensive, and work pressure is too intense. The demographic time bomb is ticking. By 2100, China's population could shrink to around 600 million, less than half its current size. A country can't grow economically with a rapidly declining population. It's basic math. But here's what makes China's situation truly dangerous: water. China is literally running out of water. According to China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment, over 80% of groundwater in major agricultural regions is polluted, much of it too contaminated for any use. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces such severe water shortages that the World Resources Institute identifies it as one of the most water-stressed regions on Earth. Water tables are dropping by 1 meter per year. Without water, China's farms and factories will grind to a halt. Cities will become unlivable. You can print money, but you can't print rainfall. The CCP knows this crisis is existential. That's why China's severe water scarcity is influencing its management of transboundary rivers, potentially leading to restricted water flow to neighboring countries as it prioritizes its own desperate needs. But the most shocking vulnerability in China's entire system? Food security. Despite all its economic power, China has a deadly secret. It cannot feed its own people. China is increasingly dependent on foreign food to survive. In 2023 alone, it imported $215 billion worth of food, according to China Power. Its food self-sufficiency has plummeted from 94% in 2000 to just 66% in 2020, with experts warning it could drop further to 59% by 2030. If a war, pandemic, or climate disaster were to disrupt these imports, the result could be catastrophic, turning COVID-era empty grocery shelves into a distant memory. Throughout Chinese history, dynasties have fallen when they failed to feed the population. The Chinese Communist Party knows this well. It rose to power during a period of widespread hunger. A country that can't feed itself is perpetually vulnerable, no matter how many aircraft carriers it builds. As these multiple crises converge, Xi Jinping faces an impossible choice: loosening control to save the economy or tightening control to prevent instability. Either path leads to disaster. When China falls, it won't be because of military defeat. It will collapse from within as its economic miracle reverses, its water runs dry, and its people lose faith in a system that promised prosperity but delivered surveillance instead. And when that happens, the shockwaves will be felt everywhere. North Korea, the vanishing kingdom. North Korea is disappearing, not from war, not from an uprising, but from something far worse, a slow-motion demographic collapse that even Kim Jong-un can't control. The cracks are showing, and you won't believe what will truly erase North Korea from the map. On December 5, 2023, the world saw something no one expected. Kim Jong-un, one of the most ruthless dictators alive, on the verge of tears. Speaking to a room full of mothers in Pyongyang, he begged North Korean women to have more children. A dictator doesn't do that unless something is very, very wrong. On January 1, 2024, Kim officially declared North Korea's declining birth rate a national emergency. According to South Korean intelligence reports cited by Yonhap News Agency, he made population growth a top national priority for 2024, placing it right alongside his nuclear weapons program. Why the sudden panic? Because the countdown to North Korea's disappearance has already begun. According to the UN Population Division's 2023 data, North Korea's fertility rate has dropped to 1.79 births per woman, far below the 2.1 needed to sustain a stable population. The CIA's 2024 World Factbook backs this up, confirming that every year more North Koreans are dying than being born, and it's only getting worse. March 2024 projections from the Lowy Institute predict that by 2034, North Korea's population will begin an irreversible decline. By 2050, the UN Demographics Unit estimates its working-age population will shrink by 20%. By 2100, North Korea could lose half its people. But here's the shocking paradox. A desperately poor nation is experiencing the birth rates of rich countries. That's not how this is supposed to work. Poor countries typically have high fertility rates. So why is North Korea breaking every rule of population science? Because when the government's food distribution system collapsed during the 1990s famine, survival fell on black markets and underground trade networks. Women became the breadwinners. With men forced to report to useless state jobs, women took over the economy, launching the Jangmadang markets that now dominate North Korea's economy. What started as illegal food trading grew into an underground commercial network spanning the entire country. It was a revolution, but not the kind Kim Jong-un feared. Now, North Korean women are making a rational choice. They're refusing to bring children into a country with no future. Each pregnancy means economic disaster for families already on the edge. Mi Jin, who escaped North Korea in 2019, offered a window into this reality. In our neighborhood markets, the women ran everything. We called ourselves grassroots capitalists behind officials' backs. Another defector, Sun Hee, explained the brutal calculus. Pregnancy means losing your market stall for months. Women would pay 2 months' earnings for illegal Chinese birth control rather than lose their livelihood. The regime's desperate attempts to reverse this trend reveal just how little they understand the crisis. They've banned contraception, criminalized abortion, offered financial incentives, and even created mandatory matchmaking events for unmarried employees. But they've missed the fundamental reality. In a country where the average state salary is just $5 a month, even the government's new incentive of extra food rations twice a year for families with 3 or more children does little to help, especially when black market dealings can bring in 10 times as much every week. With plummeting birth rates, what happens to a military state that can't find new soldiers? The Korean People's Army, with 1.2 million active personnel, has long protected the Kim dynasty. But that military machine is disappearing before our eyes. Physical standards have deteriorated so dramatically that minimum height requirements for male recruits have dropped from 5'3" to just 4'9", evidence of how malnutrition has literally shrunk the next generation. In fact, adult male defectors under 30 are reportedly almost 10 centimeters, about 4 inches, shorter than South Korean 18-year-olds, a stark biological imprint of a nation in decline. A defector who served in an artillery unit near the DMZ from 2013 to 2020 described the absurd reality. "We spent 4 months a year farming, not training. We were soldiers who farmed, not farmers who occasionally trained." Even North Korea's prized nuclear program faces a personnel crisis. The specialized scientists needed for missile development requires years of advanced training. As the educated population shrinks, finding qualified candidates becomes impossible. Kim Jong-un has spent his entire rule focused on nuclear weapons as the key to regime survival. But the real existential threat wasn't from external invasion. It was from the demographic time bomb ticking within his own borders. North Korea won't vanish overnight. The process will be gradual, marked by increasing instability, economic deterioration, and territorial contraction. But the trajectory is clear and increasingly irreversible. A country that once threatened the world with nuclear apocalypse now faces a different kind of extinction, not with a bang, but with the quiet absence of children's laughter. Iran, reaping what it sowed. March 18, 2025, Tehran, Iran. The once proud capital of a nation that dreamed of dominating the Middle East now struggles to keep its lights on. This is Iran reaping what it sowed, a bitter harvest of catastrophic miscalculations that have brought it to the brink of total collapse. "We lost, we badly lost, we blew it." These devastating words weren't spoken by some Western analyst or Iranian dissident. They came directly from a high-ranking commander in Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps during a closed-door meeting that was never meant to reach the public. When the elite guardians of the revolution are privately admitting defeat, you know something catastrophic is unfolding. Iran's collapse isn't coming from foreign invasion or military defeat. The Islamic Republic is reaping what it sowed, a perfect storm of consequences for decades of mismanagement, corruption, and catastrophic strategic blunders. Let's start with perhaps the most mind-boggling paradox of Iran's downfall. Imagine sitting on an ocean of energy while your citizens freeze in the dark. That's the absurd reality in Iran today. Across the country, schools, universities, banks, and government offices operate on severely reduced schedules. Major highways and shopping malls regularly plunge into darkness without warning. The natural gas deficit, a staggering 260 to 350 million cubic meters daily, has created an energy crisis that would be laughable if it weren't so devastating. Just let that sink in for a moment. Iran possesses the second largest natural gas reserves on the planet, yet its president recently had to make a humiliating public apology while Iran's energy officials were literally begging Iranians to lower their home temperatures by 2 degrees Celsius just to survive the winter. And the domino effect is utterly devastating. Manufacturing output has plummeted by up to 50% as the government frantically shuts down industrial plants to divert energy to homes. Steel production has potentially collapsed by half, with some sources reporting even more dramatic declines. Without steel, Iran can't maintain its military equipment, repair its crumbling infrastructure, or sustain its defense industry. This isn't just an energy crisis, it's a national security meltdown happening in real time. Meanwhile, Iran's economy isn't just struggling, it's in complete freefall. According to the Heritage Foundation's 2025 Index of Economic Freedom, Iran languishes at a staggering 169th out of 184 countries, buried among the world's most failed, fractured, and war-ravaged states. In the Middle East and North Africa region, it ranks dead last, 14th out of 14, cementing its place as the region's most economically repressed nation. But the most heartbreaking statistic reveals the human toll of this economic apocalypse. More than a third of all Iranians have plunged below the poverty line, while inflation has exceeded a staggering 40% for 5 consecutive years. Picture that, half of your purchasing power vanishing in just half a decade with no relief in sight. You're probably wondering how a nation sitting on some of the world's largest oil reserves could possibly find itself in such dire economic straits. The answer reveals how Iran is reaping what it sowed through perhaps the most disastrous strategic gamble in its history. Between 2018 and 2023, despite crippling sanctions, Iran somehow managed to earn a staggering $253 billion in oil revenues. That's money that could have rebuilt crumbling infrastructure, modernized the energy sector, or provided relief to struggling citizens. Instead, somewhere between $30 to $50 billion, a mind-boggling sum, was funneled into Syria to prop up the Assad regime. Another $20+ billion went to building proxy forces across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, and various Shia militias in Iraq. Nearly a quarter of Iran's precious oil revenue was squandered on geopolitical ventures that have now gone up in smoke. And here's the truly devastating part. With Syria's change of government, Iran's carefully constructed land bridge to its proxies has been completely severed. Now Iran is reaping what it sowed. The billions spent building influence have essentially evaporated overnight. But if you thought Iran's current situation was dire, what lies ahead is truly nightmarish. A demographic time bomb that threatens to erase the Islamic Republic from the map entirely. Iran is aging at a pace that demographers find almost impossible to comprehend. According to Iran's own National Population Research Institute, the country's 90.6 million strong population is aging 5 times faster than it's growing, a rate of decline with few parallels in human history. By 2050, 1/3 of all Iranians will be over 60, a 3-fold increase from 2021. But even that alarming statistic doesn't capture the full horror of what's coming. Interior Minister Eskandar Momeni recently issued a warning that sent shockwaves through the government. Iran's population could shrink by more than half over the next 75 years. Let that sink in. The Islamic Republic isn't just facing decline, it's facing potential extinction as a nation. For the first time in the Islamic Republic's history, terrifying questions are emerging about whether members of the regime's hard base, the ideologically committed supporters who form the backbone of its security apparatus, will continue to defend the system when the next wave of unrest inevitably erupts. The parallels to Syria's collapse are impossible to ignore. It was the demoralization and abandonment of Assad's security forces that led to the downfall of the Ba'athist regime. Iran's leadership is watching the same nightmare scenario unfold in slow motion. One retired Revolutionary Guard member, speaking anonymously, delivered a devastating assessment. "We sacrificed everything for the revolution. And what do we have to show for it? We can't even keep the lights on." As Iran's regime begins to buckle, intelligence agencies warn that extremist elements within the IRGC might do something reckless, very reckless. We're talking about potential last-ditch attacks on U.S. forces in the region or strikes on critical oil infrastructure in Saudi Arabia or the UAE, acts that could ignite a regional war overnight. The Islamic Republic is caught in a perfect storm of catastrophic proportions: an energy crisis, economic collapse, demographic death spiral, and evaporating legitimacy, all while facing unprecedented international pressure and looming military threats. When systems are as fundamentally broken as Iran's, even small sparks can ignite an unstoppable conflagration. What we're witnessing isn't just a nation in crisis, it's the final death throes of a revolutionary regime that has exhausted its ideological, economic, and demographic resources. Venezuela, paradise lost. Venezuela should be one of the richest countries on earth. It sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, a staggering 304 billion barrels, more than even Saudi Arabia. Its fertile soil, temperate climate, and abundant water resources should make it an agricultural powerhouse. Instead, Venezuela has become a case study in how to destroy a nation from within. Once the wealthiest country in Latin America, Venezuela now ranks among the poorest. How did a country with such immense natural wealth fall so far, so fast? The answer begins with Hugo Chavez, who came to power in 1999 promising to use Venezuela's oil wealth to lift the poor. When oil prices soared in the 2000s, his government spent lavishly on social programs, nationalized industries, and expanded state control over the economy. But beneath the surface, the foundations were crumbling. Corruption became endemic. State-owned companies, including the oil giant PDVSA, were staffed with political loyalists rather than qualified managers. Maintenance was neglected. Investment in new technologies stopped. When Chavez died in 2013, his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, inherited a system already on the brink. As oil prices plummeted, the house of cards collapsed. The numbers are staggering. According to the IMF, Venezuela's economy has shrunk by 80% since 2013, the largest contraction of any country not at war in modern history. Hyperinflation reached an almost unimaginable 130,000% in 2018. Even after multiple currency redenominations that lopped zeros off the bolivar, inflation remains among the highest in the world in 2025. The human toll has been catastrophic. According to a 2023 survey by the country's major universities, 82% of Venezuelans live in poverty, with 53% in extreme poverty. Food insecurity affects 92% of households. The minimum wage, about $5 per month, buys less than a week's worth of food. In fact, the basic food basket of 60 essential items now costs over $550, meaning it would take more than 150 monthly salaries just to survive. Venezuela's health system, once a model for Latin America, has virtually collapsed. Hospitals lack even basic supplies like antibiotics, surgical gloves, and clean water, according to Médicos por la Salud. 70% of Venezuela's hospitals experience power outages lasting at least 6 hours in 2024. Maternal mortality has increased by 65% since 2015. Malaria, once almost eradicated, has surged by 400% according to the WHO. Vaccine-preventable diseases like measles and diphtheria have returned. The result has been the largest migration crisis in the Western Hemisphere's modern history. Nearly 8 million Venezuelans, more than one quarter of the country's pre-crisis population, have fled, according to the UN's latest data. But amidst this catastrophe, something remarkable is happening. The collapse of the state has forced Venezuelans to create their own solutions. A parallel economy using dollars, cryptocurrencies, and barter has emerged. Communities have organized to provide services the government no longer can. In Caracas, neighborhood councils now handle everything from garbage collection to security. In Maracaibo, local engineers have built microgrids to provide electricity when the national grid fails. Throughout the country, abandoned factories have been repurposed as community centers, and there are signs that Maduro's grip is weakening. According to leaked internal polling from March 2025, the regime's support has fallen to just 18%. The military, along the regime's backbone, is experiencing defections at record rates. For the first time, mid-level officers are openly discussing a post-Maduro future. Oil production, the regime's lifeline, continues its catastrophic decline. PDVSA now produces barely 892,000 barrels per day, down from 3.5 million at its peak. Industry experts say that without massive investment and technical expertise, Venezuela's oil infrastructure may suffer irreversible damage. Even Maduro's international allies are showing fatigue. China, which has loaned Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, has drastically reduced new funding. Russia, distracted by its own crises, has scaled back support. Cuba, itself struggling economically, can no longer provide the intelligence and security assistance Maduro has relied on. The pressure is building. In January 2025, protests erupted in 16 of Venezuela's 23 states after another round of power cuts. Unlike previous demonstrations, these included traditionally pro-government neighborhoods. For the first time, workers from state-owned companies joined the protest. Maduro responded with familiar tactics, violence, and repression. But according to human rights observers, security forces in several cities refused orders to fire on protesters, a significant crack in the regime's control apparatus. The question is no longer if Venezuela's regime will collapse, but when and what comes after. The country's reconstruction will require not just economic reforms, but rebuilding institutions hollowed out by decades of corruption and mismanagement. History shows that transitions from authoritarian rule are rarely smooth. Venezuela, with its militarized society and proliferation of armed groups, faces particular risks of prolonged instability. The international community's approach to a post-Maduro Venezuela will be crucial in determining whether the country can recover or descends further into chaos. As Venezuela teeters on the brink, one thing is clear: the collapse of Maduro's regime won't be the end of Venezuela's crisis. It will be the beginning of a new and equally challenging chapter in the country's history. Russia, the Hollow Empire. Russia is in trouble, big trouble. You've probably heard that Putin's Russia is a superpower on the rise, a military force to be reckoned with, an economic powerhouse fueled by endless energy resources. Well, this story is completely falling apart. What we're about to share with you isn't just speculation or wishful thinking. These are cold, hard facts that reveal the truth about Russia's unstoppable decline. A collapse happening in real time before our eyes. Buckle up. Some of these facts are so shocking you might think they're made up. They're not, like how Putin's own TV propaganda suggested he resign on state television, or how Russia's entire emergency fund will vanish by fall 2025. You'll see why China is already relabeling Russian cities with Chinese names, and why experts increasingly worry about who controls the world's largest nuclear arsenal as Russia unravels. But let's start with the most humiliating moment in recent Russian history. In August 2024, Ukraine did something that would have seemed insane just 2 years earlier. They invaded Russia. Not with some massive army either. Just 300 soldiers wearing blue tape on their arms crossed the border at 8 a.m. Within 24 hours, Ukrainian forces were racing towards Sudzha, a town 6 miles inside Russia. 3 days in, they'd pushed to Karevino, 13 miles past the border. By the end of August, Ukraine controlled about 500 square miles of Russian territory. A nuclear superpower, the country with the world's largest arsenal of nuclear weapons, couldn't stop a few hundred Ukrainian soldiers from capturing its territory. If that sounds bad, remember what happened to Russia's once mighty navy. In the Black Sea, Ukraine has destroyed or severely damaged over 33% of Russia's naval force, including its flagship, the Moskva. The truly jaw-dropping part? Ukraine doesn't even have a navy to speak of. They're sinking Russian warships with makeshift sea drones controlled by operators sitting in basements hundreds of miles away. The Black Sea Fleet that was supposed to enforce a blockade on Ukraine is now hiding behind the Crimean Bridge, afraid to venture into open water. The report figures are staggering. According to the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces, Russian troop losses since February 2022 have amounted to almost 1 million, encompassing those killed, wounded, missing, or captured. Even if that's high, independent sources confirm at least 106,000 Russians have died in Ukraine as of May 2025. That's more soldiers than Russia lost in 10 years fighting in Afghanistan back in the 1980s. In fact, it's more than Russia lost in all its wars since World War II combined. But here's where things get really interesting. While Russia's military is getting demolished on the battlefield, something even more unprecedented is happening inside Russia itself. In Russia, criticizing Putin can get you thrown out a window, literally. That's what makes the events of September 22, 2024 so extraordinary. Vladimir Solovyov, Putin's top TV propagandist, the man awarded the prestigious Order of Honor from Putin himself, went completely off script during his primetime show on Channel 1 Russia. While discussing Ukrainian attacks near Russia's western borders, he suddenly said, "A resignation is necessary." Did Putin's most loyal mouthpiece just suggest that Putin needs to resign? On state TV? The one Putin controls? The studio fell silent. His co-host froze. Someone gasped audibly in the background. This wasn't a one-off blunder. When the regime's loudest cheerleaders start hedging their bets, you know the ship is sinking. And it's not just the elites who are turning on Putin. For years, Russians who protested the regime disappeared into prisons. Speaking out meant losing everything. Something fundamental has shifted. In the village of Ogovka, near Ukraine, residents wrote an open letter to Putin himself. "We ask you to end this cursed war," they wrote. "We've been living in hell over the past 3 months." Regular Russians living inside Russia publicly calling Putin's war cursed, the kind of statement that once guaranteed a one-way ticket to Siberia. Now people are saying it anyway. Behind Russia's political problems lurks an even more devastating reality. Its money is running out. The National Wealth Fund, Russia's emergency money stash, has crashed from $117 billion in 2021 to just $39 billion as of April 2025. Strip away the gold, and that figure shrinks even further. At the current burn rate, experts predict Russia's liquid reserves will be completely gone by fall 2025. Not diminished, gone, empty, zero. And yet Russia plans to spend over $145 billion on defense in 2025 alone. It's like draining your retirement account to buy a tank while your house is burning down. As Russia's financial safety net vanishes, a different kind of crisis is killing the country from within. Russians are drowning in alcohol. Between January and October 2024 alone, Russians guzzled 1.84 billion liters of alcohol, the highest volume recorded since 2017. Vodka, Russia's national drink and silent killer, leads the charge. In just 10 months, Russians downed 620 million liters of the stuff. Russian men now die on average 10.2 years earlier than Russian women, creating one of the worst gender gaps in life expectancy worldwide. A quarter of all male deaths directly trace back to alcohol. This isn't just bad health policy. For centuries, Russian rulers have deliberately fueled mass alcoholism to keep their people docile, obedient, and too drunk to revolt. Putin keeps this tradition alive. As vodka kills individual Russians, it's simultaneously killing Russia's future as a nation. Russia's birth rate has nosedived to its lowest level in 25 years, just 11.1 births per 1,000 people in 2024. The war has turned this slow decline into a demographic emergency. When Putin called up 300,000 men for his partial mobilization in 2022, about 700,000 young Russians, mostly men, immediately fled the country. Not random Russians either. These were doctors, engineers, tech experts, the very people who typically start families and build economies. The math is brutal. For every 12 to 13 people who die in Russia, only about 8 babies are born. This isn't a temporary dip, it's a population extinction event. Putin's desperate solution? Import workers from other countries. Russia now relies on 6 to 14 million migrant workers, mostly from Central Asian countries. But perhaps the most alarming threat of all is one that should keep the entire world awake at night. What happens to the world's largest nuclear arsenal when a country falls apart? Russia maintains approximately 5,889 nuclear warheads as of 2024. The safe maintenance and control of these weapons requires a stable, skilled workforce of nuclear technicians, military officers, and security personnel. As alcoholism, economic collapse, and war decimate Russia's working-age male population, precisely the demographic that staffs these facilities, the risks of accidents, miscalculations, or security breaches grow substantially. What happens if Russia's collapse leads to a power struggle, with different factions fighting for control of nuclear weapons? Or if separatist regions housing nuclear facilities declare independence? The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 left nuclear weapons scattered across newly independent states. We could be headed for a similar scenario, but in a much more chaotic and dangerous context. Russia isn't just experiencing temporary setbacks, it's facing systemic collapse on multiple fronts simultaneously. Military defeats, economic freefall, demographic disaster, and political instability are converging to create a perfect storm. Putin's regime may be able to maintain control in the short term through repression and propaganda, but the foundations are crumbling, and the collapse, when it comes, will be rapid and dramatic. Conclusion: when evil empires fall. The collapse of these regimes won't mean the end of global threats. It could multiply them. When empires fall, they rarely go quietly. History tells us that dying regimes become more dangerous, not less. As their grip on power weakens, their desperation grows. For China, the crisis of water scarcity combined with the real estate collapse could trigger both internal conflict and external aggression. A desperate CCP might view Taiwan as a distraction from domestic problems, or worse, as a solution to them. North Korea's demographic death spiral creates the nightmare scenario of a nuclear arsenal controlled by an increasingly unstable and desperate regime. What happens when Kim Jong-un realizes his dynasty is ending? Iran's multiple crises could lead hardline IRGC factions to launch desperate attacks on regional targets, triggering a wider Middle Eastern conflict that draws in global powers. Venezuela's collapse could unleash waves of migration that destabilize the entire Western Hemisphere while creating power vacuums that drug cartels and armed groups rush to fill. Russia's decline poses perhaps the greatest threat of all, the world's largest nuclear arsenal in a country experiencing institutional failure, with separatist regions, competing power centers, and a leadership losing its grip on reality. These collapses won't happen in isolation. They'll interact and accelerate each other in unpredictable ways. China's economic problems will impact Russia's already fragile finances. North Korea's instability will affect both Chinese and Russian security calculations. Venezuela's oil production impacts Iran's position in energy markets. The world isn't prepared for multiple simultaneous state failures among nuclear-armed and major regional powers. Our international institutions were designed to manage conflicts between stable states, not to contain the fallout from collapsing empires. But amidst these dangers lie opportunities. The end of these repressive regimes could free hundreds of millions of people. New democratic governments could emerge. Long-frozen conflicts could find resolution. The question isn't whether these regimes will collapse. The evidence points clearly to their unsustainability. The question is how we manage their decline to minimize the dangers and maximize the possibilities for a more stable global order. As we watch these evil empires approach their breaking points, we should remember that what replaces them could be better or much worse. The difference will depend on how prepared the international community is for the coming storms. What do you think? Which of these regimes will fall first? And what will happen when they do? Share your predictions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more unfiltered geopolitical insights.
With over 2 billion followers, Islam is one of the most powerful religions on earth. But something catastrophic is happening. Silently and almost invisibly, it's being erased from the map. Not by war, not by politics, but by something far simpler and utterly unstoppable. A force that Islam can never control. It's March 27, 2035. The morning call to prayer that once echoed through cities like Casablanca has fallen silent in many neighborhoods. What was once unthinkable has become reality as mosques across the world stand empty or repurposed. Islam, the faith that shaped civilizations for 1,400 years, has experienced an unprecedented decline in just 2 decades, all because of something that seemed so innocent at first. a Wi-Fi signal. Had anyone suggested a few years prior that smartphones would do more damage to Islam than 1,000 crusades, they'd have been dismissed as delusional. Yet that's exactly what's happening, not through conquest or force, but through the quiet revolution of information. Today, we'll uncover how this digital transformation occurred, why online connectivity became Islam's greatest vulnerability, and what this unprecedented shift means for the future of Muslim faith in our connected world. What the internet is doing to Islam today has actually happened before, and the parallels are shocking. 15th century Europe. A German innovator named Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press. Suddenly, priests lose their monopoly on the Bible. For centuries, the church controlled access, interpreting scripture in Latin, essentially gatekeeping salvation. The printing press changed all that. The Bible was translated into local languages, and ordinary people could read it for the first time. And what did they find? Contradictions, corruption, and rules that didn't quite align with the church's teachings. Enter Martin Luther, monk and theologian who wasn't thrilled with the church selling indulgences, basically a get-out-of-hell card for a fee. His 95 Thesis called out this corruption, arguing that salvation came through faith, not cash. With the printing press, his ideas spread like wildfire across Europe, making the church's control over religious thought impossible to maintain. And you think the Catholic Church was upset about Luther? Just wait until you hear what happened next. The Protestant Reformation erupted, a tidal wave of new denominations, debates, and dissenters challenging church authority. This shattered the clergy's exclusive claim to spiritual truth and propelled Europe toward individual interpretation and independent thought. The printing press effectively dismantled centuries of religious dogma. As people engaged directly with Scripture, they questioned not just church practices, but Christianity's fundamental tenets. Faith transformed into something personal and decentralized, removing religious institutions as the sole arbiters of salvation and morality. The once unshakable authority of these institutions began its slow collapse. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. The Enlightenment followed, a period when science, philosophy, and reason began to take center stage. The result? Growing skepticism of religion as a whole and the rise of secularism in Europe. Over the centuries, this trend snowballed, leading to societies where secular worldviews, not Christianity, became dominant in many countries. In places like Sweden, France, and the UK, religious adherence is now at historic lows, with vast majorities identifying as atheist, agnostic, or spiritual, but not religious. It didn't happen overnight, but the printing press lit the spark that set this transformation in motion. Now you're probably wondering, if the printing press could shake Christianity to its core, why did Islam seem immune for so long? The answer might shock you. Christianity had a head start on Islam. Muhammad came onto the scene in the 7th century, claiming divine revelations in a cave near Mecca. And many scholars agree that Islam incorporated theological and narrative elements from Judaism and Christianity into an Arabian religious framework. Even many Quranic stories like Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, and Moses parting the sea appear in both the Bible and the Quran, albeit with variations that align with Arabian contexts. But unlike Christianity, which had centuries to adapt to modernity and face challenges like the Enlightenment, Islam has largely avoided that reckoning through empires, caliphates, and strict clerical control, and maintained a tighter grip on interpretation and authority. A perfect example of this adaptation disparity can be found in how each religion responded to scientific discoveries. When Galileo challenged geocentrism in the 17th century, the Catholic Church eventually reconciled with heliocentrism. By the 19th century, many Christian denominations were reinterpreting Genesis to accommodate Darwin's theory of evolution. Contrast this with how many Islamic clerics still reject evolution outright, with several Muslim-majority countries banning its teaching in schools. A 2018 Pew Research survey found that acceptance of evolution among Muslims in various countries averaged around 27%, compared to 68% among Christians in developed nations. But what happens when a religion establishes control through fear? This next part might make you uncomfortable.
This tight grip involved enforcing the faith by any means necessary. Take the apostate wars after Muhammad's death, when several tribes decided they were done with Islam. Following his death, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, launched brutal campaigns to bring them back into the fold. Their crime? Apostasy, leaving Islam. This harsh stance wasn't a bug in the system, it was a feature, a way to ensure Islam's survival by stamping out dissent early on. Any deviation from the pure teachings of Islam as practiced by Muhammad and his companions was labeled heresy. In other words, questioning or adapting the faith to new circumstances wasn't just frowned upon, it could get you killed. Reformation was not an option. Just when you thought it couldn't get more controlling, it does. A cornerstone of Islamic teachings is to keep the faithful in line. The Quran itself warns believers about probing too deeply. It says, "O you who have believed, do not ask about things which, if they are shown to you, will distress you." Quran, chapter 5, verse 101. Translation: don't ask questions you might not like the answers to. This effectively discouraged curiosity and intellectual exploration. Muhammad reinforced this stance in Hadith, reportedly declaring, "The greatest sinners among the Muslims are those who ask too many questions." The message was clear. Unquestioning faith is virtuous. Inquiry is dangerous. The reasoning? Questions inevitably expose inconsistencies in the doctrine. Here's the irony that no one saw coming. This tight control over beliefs and practices succeeded for centuries, enabling Islam to expand while maintaining remarkable uniformity across diverse empires. The paradox, however, lies in this rigidity. Any belief system that aggressively suppresses change and inquiry ultimately becomes fragile and vulnerable to collapse. Throughout history, dissenters had no infrastructure to connect, share doubts, or build communities. Then everything changed with the arrival of the internet, a borderless realm where every question, no matter how forbidden, found a voice. The internet has revolutionized how people approach religious questioning. According to former Muslims interviewed by EXMNA, Ex-Muslims of North America, in their 2023 survey of apostates, online forums were cited as the primary catalyst for religious doubting by 78% of respondents. One respondent from Saudi Arabia described how digital connections broke their isolation. Growing up in a country where apostasy is punishable by death creates an overwhelming sense of isolation. You believe you're alone in your doubts. The internet shattered that illusion overnight. Suddenly, I discovered thousands of others asking the same questions I'd been afraid to whisper. Islam stood exposed, its layers peeled back to reveal contradictions, moral inconsistencies, and centuries of dogma that had never faced genuine scrutiny. The digital revolution accomplished something unprecedented. It forced an entire belief system into the unforgiving spotlight of public accountability. Religious authorities who had controlled the narrative for generations suddenly found themselves powerless, their exclusive interpretive authority evaporating in the face of mass information access. You might be thinking this sounds far-fetched. Prepare to be surprised. The data tells a compelling story. According to research from Pew Research Center, around 24% of people raised as Muslims in the U.S. end up leaving the faith, a number that closely mirrors the disaffiliation rates of Christianity in the same region. Globally, the trend is harder to track due to the stigma and legal punishment, but it's clear apostasy is on the rise and the internet is playing a massive role. Platforms like Reddit's Ex-Muslim with over 400,000 members and X hashtags like #ExMuslimBecause have created safe spaces for people to openly discuss their doubts, share their stories, and find solidarity. And this isn't just limited to Western countries. In places like Saudi Arabia, surveys suggest a significant portion of the youth, up to 25%, identify as non-religious. Think about that. In a country where atheism is equated with terrorism, 1 in 4 young people is questioning religion. The digital age has given rise to a phenomenon sociologists now refer to as virtual ummahs, online religious communities that transcend borders and geography. These digital spaces enable believers, doubters, and ex-believers to interact in ways that were previously impossible. As Dr. Samina Ali, professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University, explains, "What we're witnessing is unprecedented in Islamic history, the democratization of religious interpretation." When a 16-year-old in Indonesia can directly challenge a fatwa from Al-Azhar scholars on X and gather substantial support, traditional authority structures begin to crumble. Statistical analysis from the World Values Survey highlights this generational shift. Among Muslims under 30 in countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Tunisia, religious practice declined by 12 to 17% between 2012 and 2022. Simultaneously, the proportion of youth identifying as spiritual but not religious has nearly tripled. You might find it hard to believe, but digital connectivity has already sparked dramatic shifts in traditionally Islamic societies. A 2020 study published in The Conversation revealed that in Iran, religious belief has undergone a seismic transformation. Research by the Group for Analyzing and Measuring Attitudes in Iran found that while 78% of Iranians believed in God, only 32% identified as Shia Muslims. Furthermore, 47% reported having transitioned from being religious to non-religious, and only 30% identified as Muslim, starkly contrasting with the government's official claim of 99.5% Muslim identification. And just when you thought that was shocking, wait until you see what's happening online. The internet has transformed Islam into a global meme. On platforms like TikTok and YouTube, creators openly critique Islamic doctrines, hadith, and controversial aspects of Muhammad's life, all with a healthy dose of satire. Online, questions that might lead to prosecution or death in some countries are freely debated. Why did Muhammad ban dogs and music but not slavery? Why did he marry Aisha at such a young age? Are we seriously meant to believe he rode a flying steed to heaven and split the moon? For younger Muslims, these questions help shatter taboos. There's also the rise of public ex-Muslim voices. Figures like Ayaan Hirsi Ali and digital creators such as the apostate prophet. These voices, once unimaginable in public discourse, now lead the charge in normalizing critique of Islam. What's most astonishing is the speed of the shift. Dr. Mustafa Akyol, senior fellow at the Cato Institute, observes, "What took Christianity centuries to experience, public questioning, reformation, secularization, Islam is going through in just decades, largely due to the internet's rapid spread of ideas." This acceleration is evident in how Islamic authorities respond to criticism. In 2010, threats against cartoonists depicting Muhammad led to widespread self-censorship across Western media. Yet by 2025, major streaming platforms began distributing shows and documentaries that critically examine Islamic history, despite backlash from religious institutions. The economic angle is equally significant. According to analysis from the Technology and Religion Institute's 2024 Global Survey, countries with over 85% internet penetration show religious disaffiliation rates 3 to 4 times higher than countries with less than 40% connectivity. The link between open information access and declining religious adherence is becoming increasingly clear. This wave of critique isn't coming only from within. In the West, Islam's protected status in public discourse has eroded over time. The late Christopher Hitchens, a vocal proponent of secularism and free speech, regularly challenged Islamic doctrines. Cultural moments also played a role. In 2006, South Park aired episodes mocking Muhammad, sparking global outrage and renewed debates over satire's limits. Then came the 2015 Charlie Hebdo attack, a tragedy that not only exposed the risks of religious criticism, but also galvanized defenders of free expression worldwide. These voices and events have significantly eroded the fear surrounding criticism of Islam. The taboo has been pierced, and now Islam's sacred aura is fading faster than anyone could have predicted. No longer untouchable, the religion is being questioned, debated, and ridiculed in ways that would have been unthinkable just a generation ago. Just listen to Imam Muhammad Tawhidi's warning. It is happening continuously. It is going to become an avalanche, a tsunami that is going to hit our community in such a way that we will have a very difficult time standing. It will knock us over. But if you think that's dramatic, you haven't seen what's happening next. Islamic regimes are intensifying digital repression in response. Iran, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia have ramped up surveillance, censorship, and punishment for online dissent. Yet these efforts consistently backfire. The decentralized nature of the internet makes information nearly impossible to control. Every blocked website triggers VPN workarounds. Encrypted chat platforms emerge. Anonymous voices rise to replace silenced ones. Censorship now creates the opposite of its intended effect. When content is removed from one site, it appears across dozens more. The imprisonment of a single atheist blogger often transforms local suppression into global resistance. Far from silencing dissent, these tactics inspire others to ask forbidden questions and share the answers worldwide. The result is an accelerating cycle of religious questioning that amplifies with each attempt to suppress it. The world is witnessing a historic transformation. A faith that once executed those who merely whispered doubt now finds itself openly critiqued, challenged, and abandoned by millions in real time. This unprecedented exodus stems from a simple technological reality. The digital age has made the suppression of questions fundamentally impossible. Now, defenders of Islam might argue, wait a minute, Islam is growing at a fast rate regardless, and sure, on the surface that's true. But here's what they don't want you to know. Let's look a little deeper. Islam's rapid growth isn't coming from widespread conversions. In fact, it's almost entirely birthright-driven, concentrated in underdeveloped countries with high fertility rates. For example, countries like Niger, Somalia, and Afghanistan have some of the highest fertility rates in the world, averaging 4 to 7 children per woman. These are also regions where female empowerment and education rates are alarmingly low. Research consistently shows a strong connection between fertility rates and women's access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities. In many Muslim-majority countries, restrictive cultural norms and limited access to education keep women out of the workforce and in traditional roles, leading to larger families. Compare this to Western countries where Muslim immigrant families experience a noticeable drop in fertility rates over just 1 or 2 generations. For instance, Muslim women in Germany or the US often have fertility rates closer to the national average, about 1.5 to 2 children per woman. Why the change? Because once women have access to education, contraception, and greater autonomy, family sizes tend to shrink. This pattern is remarkably consistent across diverse cultural settings. A longitudinal study tracking Muslim immigrants in France over 3 generations found that by the 3rd generation, fertility rates had declined from 5.8 children per woman to just 2.1, almost identical to native French rates. Similar patterns emerge in the UK, Canada, and Australia. The educational factor cannot be overstated. According to UNESCO's Global Education Database, for every additional year of education a Muslim woman receives, her fertility rate drops by approximately 0.3 children. When comparing regions within the same Muslim-majority country, areas with higher female literacy rates consistently show lower birth rates and higher rates of religious disaffiliation. The economic implications are equally significant. The World Bank's analysis shows that as per capita GDP increases in Muslim-majority countries, religious observance tends to decrease, particularly among the professional classes. This helps explain why wealthy Gulf states now struggle with rising secularism despite massive investments in religious education. Economic development inevitably brings exposure to global ideas and values that challenge traditional religious frameworks. Most revealing of all is the unprecedented rise in apostasy among born Muslims, particularly in Western societies. Even more striking is the data on Islamic converts. Research indicates that between 50 and 70% of Americans who convert to Islam eventually leave the faith. This creates a stunning reality. The majority of those who voluntarily embrace Islam ultimately choose to leave it behind. Pew Research highlights that in the U.S., although Islam gains new followers through conversion, the number of people raised Muslim who leave the faith is significantly higher. About 23 to 25% of those born into Muslim families eventually abandon Islam. Globally, Islam's image as the fastest-growing religion needs context. It's a demographic illusion. Yes, the numbers are increasing, not because of ideological appeal, It's a birth rate story rooted in underdeveloped regions and one that is increasingly challenged as Muslims migrate to more secular, empowered societies. So when people argue that Islam's growth is inevitable, the truth is far more complex. As education levels rise and the internet reaches even the most remote corners, the dynamics will shift. High education, especially for women, fosters critical thinking and the questioning of long-held beliefs. Combine that with exposure to diverse ideas online, and suddenly people aren't limited to their local imam's teachings. They're engaging with ex-Muslims, historians, scientists, and philosophers. This is already happening in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia. The rise of the non-religious among the educated and internet-savvy youth shows how powerful this combination is. This brings us to perhaps the most surprising development in this unfolding story. Many Muslims are either misguided or engaging in some creative reinterpretation of their religion. Some do it intentionally with a concept called taqiyya, while others simply repeat what they've been told without digging deeper. Either way, they end up whitewashing Islam. You've probably heard the excuses. Islam is feminist. Sure, a religion where a man can marry 4 women and a woman's testimony is worth half of a man's in court, totally feminist. Or Muhammad was not a warlord with a child bride. Let's just ignore the countless hadith that say otherwise, right? Islam has no colonial past, except for centuries of conquest under the Ottomans and other empires. Slavery never happened in Islam, conveniently forgetting it was sanctioned in both the Quran and the hadith. The list goes on. Women's rights, LGBTQ acceptance, tolerance, you name it, the denial and whitewashing are almost impressive. But here's a twist. In trying to make Islam look more palatable to modern audiences, many are inadvertently reforming it by denying or downplaying the less savory parts of the faith. They're reshaping it, consciously or not, into something that aligns more closely with modern values. And if this continues over the long term, it could actually lead to a large-scale reformation. This inadvertent reformation isn't merely theoretical. It's already unfolding in real time. Take the case of progressive Muslim communities in cities like London, Berlin, and New York, where LGBTQ-affirming mosques now exist despite Islam's traditional prohibitions on homosexuality. Or consider the growing movement of female imams in Western countries, directly challenging centuries of male-dominated religious leadership. While traditionalists may dismiss these efforts as fringe, their influence is expanding through social media and reaching even conservative Muslim circles. The Muslim feminist movement provides perhaps the most striking example. Organizations like Musawa, meaning equality in Arabic, reinterpret Islamic texts through a feminist lens, challenging patriarchal interpretations that have held sway for centuries. Their advocacy has already influenced legal reforms in countries like Morocco and Tunisia, which have modified family codes to grant women greater rights, all while maintaining claims to Islamic legitimacy. Meanwhile, digital Islamic scholarship platforms are flourishing. These sites, like Critical Islamic Studies, welcome historical critical approaches to religious texts, a method once considered anathema to Islamic learning. With millions of monthly visitors from Muslim-majority countries, they're creating spaces where even the most fundamental assumptions about doctrine and history can be questioned. It's exactly what happened with Christianity over time. Reinterpretations and reformist movements softened it into what we see today. So, whether they realize it or not, Muslims insisting that Islam is feminist, tolerant, and progressive are planting the seeds for a very different version of the religion. And that, ironically, might be the reformation they claim Islam doesn't need. It's almost poetic, really. The same people defending the faith are unknowingly transforming it. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the story ends. Of course, for any meaningful reform to take root, certain conditions are crucial. This kind of transformation only thrives in environments where free thought is protected, places that embrace integration and resist the pull of hardliners. In the West, that means standing firm against policies that undermine these freedoms. Mass unchecked immigration needs to be carefully managed. Blasphemy laws disguised as hate speech regulations must be resisted. The right to question, criticize, and even mock is the foundation of intellectual progress. Without it, reform collapses before it can begin. And yet, the catalyst for this transformation, the silent force rewriting the narrative, will almost certainly be the internet. A network with no borders, no clerics, and no fear of blasphemy, it has become the great equalizer of ideas. History may ultimately record that Islam wasn't transformed by military conquest or political revolution, but by something far more subtle yet infinitely more powerful: the unstoppable flow of digital information that connected questioning minds across the globe. But what do you think? Is the future of Islam being reshaped by the internet? Or is this just the beginning of something even bigger? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this video insightful, make sure you like, subscribe, and tap that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. This is Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia. 3 nations spread across 3 different continents. But despite the distance, one alarming truth connects them all: they are collapsing in exactly the same way. And now, the symptoms are impossible to ignore. Let's begin where the cracks are turning into a full-blown collapse: Canada. In Canada today, the average family can't afford a home in their own country. Home ownership has crashed 31% in a single generation. Compounding this issue, foreign buyers now hold a significant stake in the Canadian property market, owning up to 13% of it, more than at any point in history. But Canada isn't alone. In Britain, the foundation of the middle class has been gutted. Manufacturing jobs gone, down 46% since 1990. And what did families get in return? The highest tax burden since World War II. All while public services fell apart. But this isn't just a British problem. Across the world, Australia is living the same nightmare, only deeper. There, a quiet takeover is underway. Foreign corporations now control 80% of the country's critical resources. And the dream of home ownership? Dead on arrival. Housing prices have soared by 500%, while wages crawled just 80%. Young Australians are being priced out of their future in their own country. And this pattern across continents, across governments, is no accident. This isn't just failure. It's not bad luck. It's called managed decline, and it's happening by design. And if you're watching this thinking it can't happen here, you need to pay attention, because these 3 nations are the test cases for what's already occurring throughout the Western world. What you're about to learn in this video will completely change how you understand what's happening to these once powerful nations, and why everyone should be deeply concerned about what comes next. The evidence is hiding in plain sight. Government documents, insider testimonies, and statistical patterns reveal a blueprint that's been quietly unfolding for decades. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Most people have no idea that the collapse of these 3 nations follows a familiar historical pattern. Every empire throughout history has fallen in a similar way, from the inside out. Take ancient Rome. Most think it fell to barbarian invasions, but Rome's real decline began internally, through economic inequality that mirror what's happening across Canada, the UK, and Australia right now. By the 2nd century AD, as Rome's expansion slowed, the wealthy elite created massive estates worked by imported labor. This destroyed local Roman farmers, the backbone of the Republic, who were crushed by debt and displacement. Sound familiar? It should. It's the exact same pattern unfolding today. When Roman reformers tried addressing these inequalities, they were eliminated. The elites chose to get rid of reformers rather than give up their power. A key point to remember as we look at what's happening in these modern nations. Just as Rome faced demographic collapse in its final years, these 3 nations are experiencing unprecedented population shifts. Despite Canada importing over 480,000 migrants in 2024 alone, its fertility rate has plummeted to just 1.48 children per woman, far below the replacement level. The UK's fertility rate has crashed to 1.44, while Australia's sits at 1.5. These countries aren't growing naturally, they're being artificially repopulated while their middle classes vanish, exactly as Rome's did before its fall. Managed decline might sound like boring corporate jargon, but it represents one of the most dangerous concepts in modern governance. Originally a business term for companies beyond saving, it evolved into a strategy where maintaining appearances takes priority over actual solutions. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented policy. The concept emerged during the 1980s in Britain when Margaret Thatcher's government advised that struggling industrial cities should be left to manage decline, controlling the collapse rather than preventing it. But what's truly shocking? This localized strategy has now been scaled up to the national level across Canada, the UK, and Australia, and the evidence isn't hidden. It's being announced openly. Don't believe it? Just look at the official messaging coming out of these governments. Their infamous "you'll own nothing and be happy" rhetoric wasn't just a meme, it's becoming the reality for millions. In Australia, government reports warn of a generation of forever renters as home ownership slips out of reach for younger Australians. In Canada, nearly a third of people under 40 now say they expect to rent for life, according to recent surveys. And in the UK, a 2025 policy paper declared that the era of mass homeownership is over, signaling a long-term shift away from traditional property ownership. If this is your first time hearing about managed decline, prepare for a rude awakening, because once you understand how it works, you'll start seeing it everywhere. And nowhere is it more obvious than what's happening to Canada right now. Canada presents itself as a progressive, independent nation. The reality? It's being transformed back into a resource colony before our very eyes. Here's the playbook being implemented with frightening precision. First, domestic production gets strangled. Since 2009, business investment per worker in Canada has fallen by 20%, according to Statistics Canada, part of a broader trend tied to weaker market competition. Meanwhile, productivity has stagnated. Canada also recorded only 1.1% growth in real GDP per capita between 2014 and 2024, making it the second worst performer among 38 high-income countries. Second, the market gets flooded with new consumers. Canada now has the highest population growth in the G7, with 98% coming from immigration. This creates artificial GDP growth on paper while masking collapsing living standards. Meanwhile, the housing market has detached completely from economic reality. The average Toronto home now costs 11 times the median household income, more than double what financial experts consider remotely sustainable. Young Canadians aren't just unable to buy homes, they're spending up to 60% of their income on rent alone. The numbers are staggering. In March 2025, the average home price in Toronto hit $1.4 million, while Vancouver topped $1.7 million. Meanwhile, the median annual income in these cities hovers around $100,000. The math simply doesn't work anymore. And who's buying these properties? Foreign investors purchased tens of thousands of Canadian homes in recent years, with many left empty as pure investment vehicles. In fact, things got so bad that the federal government extended its foreign buyer ban to 2027. Statistics Canada data shows that non-residents owned about 7% of condos in British Columbia and 5.6% in Ontario. Clear evidence that investment demand has distorted housing supply. But wait, you might be thinking, isn't this just normal economic evolution? Think again. Most Canadians never even noticed when, back in 2015, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper publicly dismissed the middle-class prosperity platform as outdated. At the time, it sounded like political posturing. But in hindsight, it reads more like a warning, because what followed was a slow, calculated dismantling of the economic foundations that once upheld middle-class life in Canada. But here's the truly mind-blowing part. Canadian policymakers aren't failing to solve these problems. They're just ignoring the inevitable. When asked what happens if Canada's housing bubble finally bursts, analysts warned that it could trigger a financial crisis with ripple effects far beyond real estate. As Jacobin notes, Canada's housing market has become a tinderbox propped up by speculation, lax regulation, and blind faith in endless appreciation. If the bubble pops, it won't be a surprise. It'll be a disaster foretold. That's right, the system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed. If you think Canada's managed decline is shocking, just wait until you see what they've done to Britain. It's the same blueprint, just a more advanced stage. And what you're about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about modern economics. The United Kingdom, once the workshop of the world and birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, is now experiencing the fastest deindustrialization of any developed nation in history. British manufacturing, which represented 30% of GDP in the 1970s, has collapsed to just 9% today. Meanwhile, London's financial services sector has exploded, creating enormous wealth for a tiny minority while the rest of the country withers. What makes Britain's situation particularly alarming is the tax burden citizens now face. UK residents endure the highest taxation levels in over 70 years, higher than in countries like Canada, Switzerland, and Ireland, yet receive deteriorating public services in return. And it's forecast to get even worse. Government projections show the tax burden climbing further in the coming years, setting new post-war records while offering little relief to a population already feeling squeezed. A closer look at the numbers tells the shocking story. The average British worker now loses 30 to 40% of their income to taxes when all direct and indirect taxes are calculated. Yet National Health Service waiting lists have hit 7.8 million people as of March 2025. Schools are crumbling with an estimated £13.8 billion repair backlog. And over half of Britain's roads, more than 107,000 miles, are now less than 15 years away from total failure. Where's all that tax money actually going? The most revealing statistic might be this. While ordinary Britons face crushing tax burdens, more than 72% of Britain's top corporations pay less than 10% effective tax through complex offshore structures. And these same corporations are snapping up the very infrastructure being neglected by the government. Thames Water, the utility serving 15 million people, is now majority owned by foreign investment funds, including entities from Canada, Abu Dhabi, and China. While the company has not paid dividends to external shareholders since 2017, it has continued internal payments to service its substantial debt. Across England, water companies are projected to distribute £14.7 billion in dividends by 2030, even as customers face increasing bills to fund essential infrastructure repairs and address sewage pollution. But the most terrifying part of Britain's managed decline? The erasure of property ownership. Home ownership among Britons under 35 has plummeted from 65% in 1996 to just 28% today. Meanwhile, over 40% of rental properties are now owned by overseas investors who leave many units deliberately vacant as pure investment vehicles. And who's buying these properties? In London alone, nearly 27% of all homes sold in the first quarter of 2024 were snapped up by foreign buyers, 3% from the year before. Chinese and Middle Eastern investors led the surge, while American investment giants like BlackRock continued expanding their portfolios by acquiring large numbers of former public housing units. The message couldn't be clearer. Ordinary citizens are being transformed from property owners into permanent renters, from stakeholders into dependents. This isn't just the side effect, it's the primary objective. How far will they go with this plan? Look no further than Australia, the testing ground for the most extreme version of this economic transformation. What's happening there right now is a preview of what's coming for the rest of the Western world. Australia markets itself as the lucky country, a land of sunshine, prosperity, and opportunity. The reality? It's experiencing perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all three nations. Once a country with the highest home ownership in the world, Australia has seen that dream evaporate for an entire generation. Housing costs in major cities have skyrocketed, rising over 3,400% since 1975, while median full-time wages have grown just 1,183% in the same period. The culprit? A deliberate policy of hyper-immigration coupled with foreign investment incentives that have transformed housing from shelter into financial assets. Internal government documents from 2018 reveal Australian Treasury officials acknowledged this was creating a two-tier society, but proceeded anyway because it was generating significant wealth for existing property owners. Let's put some hard numbers to this transformation. In 2023, foreign buyers purchased around $15 billion worth of Australian real estate, enough to spark serious concern about housing access for locals. In response, the The government is now implementing a 2-year ban on foreign acquisitions of established dwellings starting in April 2025. Meanwhile, immigration hit a historic high, with 547,200 new arrivals approved in 2023, even as building permits for new housing dropped by 8.5%. Elementary economics tells us what happens next: skyrocketing prices that make homeownership impossible for ordinary Australians. In Sydney, the median home now costs 15.3 times the median annual household income, officially making it more unaffordable than even notoriously expensive San Francisco or New York. But the housing crisis is just one piece of Australia's managed decline. The country's natural resources, once considered the birthright of all Australians, have been systematically sold off to foreign interests. Over 86% of Australia's mining industry is now foreign-owned, with China controlling the majority stake in key sectors. Over the past 2 decades, Sydney's population has surged by nearly 40%, reaching approximately 5.56 million in 2024. This rapid growth has outpaced infrastructure development, leading to significant strain on the city's transportation systems. Consequently, Sydney now ranks among the most congested cities in Australia, with drivers spending an average of 51 hours annually stuck in traffic. At this point, you're probably wondering, if this decline is so obvious, why aren't citizens in these countries rising up in protest? That's where the most ingenious part of this whole scheme comes in. What if we told you there's a psychological operation running alongside the economic transformation? One designed specifically to make resistance impossible. The real danger lies in how these same tactics are now appearing throughout the Western world. If you've noticed increasing political polarization, the demonization of national pride, and the criminalization of certain forms of protest, you're witnessing the early stages of the same control system. There's something even more disturbing happening alongside the economic transformation of these nations: a deliberate campaign to fracture social cohesion. Strong national cultures with shared values pose the greatest threat to managed decline because they create solidarity and resistance. The solution? Fragmentation. In all 3 countries, we've seen unprecedented efforts to reframe national identities as problematic or outdated, replacing them with competing interest groups. Divided populations don't organize effective resistance. Look at what happened in Canada when the truckers protested in 2022. The government didn't just disagree with them, they froze their bank accounts, seized their assets, and labeled them extremists. In Australia, when farmers protested against climate policies that threatened their livelihoods in 2023, the government deployed surveillance technology originally developed for tracking terrorists. And in Britain, the 2023 Public Order Act gives authorities sweeping powers to shut down any protest deemed disruptive, a term so vague it can apply to virtually any meaningful demonstration. The messaging is carefully crafted, too. In all 3 countries, government-funded media push identical narratives. Homeownership is outdated, national sovereignty is xenophobic, and opposing mass migration is racist. Anyone questioning these narratives finds themselves algorithmically suppressed on social media, excluded from mainstream platforms, and in some cases, investigated by authorities. Australia has perhaps gone furthest with its Online Safety Act, giving the government unprecedented power to remove content deemed harmful, a term so broadly defined it has been used to silence economic criticism. While no official takedown order has been confirmed, online commentators have alleged that videos critical of foreign ownership, particularly those highlighting Chinese stakes in Australian infrastructure, have quietly vanished from major platforms. One such viral video, which had amassed over 3 million views and cited only publicly available corporate filings, disappeared from YouTube without warning. Whether it was removed due to algorithmic enforcement or flagged under broad harmful content guidelines, the effect was the same: dissent erased. These tactics create what psychologists call learned helplessness. When people experience enough futility in changing their circumstances, they stop trying altogether. But are we really helpless? That's where the story gets interesting. Because if you think the situation is bleak now, wait until you see the final phase of this plan that's already being set in motion. The endgame isn't just economic restructuring, it's the complete transformation of Western democracies into controlled, feudalistic systems where citizens own nothing and corporations own everything. In Canada, the 15-minute city concept is being implemented in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. In theory, it sounds benign. Everything you need within 15 minutes of your home. But in practice, it's about restricting movement and monitoring citizens. Toronto's pilot program already includes climate permits, limiting car usage to certain days of the week. In the UK, the Bank of England launched a CBDC pilot program in January 2025, with plans for full implementation by 2026. These central bank digital currencies will give governments unprecedented control over how and where you can spend your money. Imagine being unable to buy certain foods, products, or services because some algorithm deems them harmful to climate goals or socially problematic. And in Australia, the Digital ID Act passed in February 2025 creates a mandatory biometric identification system ostensibly to streamline government services. What they don't mention is that this system will track every interaction with government services, health providers, and financial institutions, creating a social credit infrastructure that mirrors China's controversial system. Now, this pattern isn't limited to just these three countries. The same warning signs are flashing across the Western world. Let's look at what's happening in the United States, for example. In 2010, the U.S. homeownership rate stood at 69%. By 2016, it had fallen to 63%, with the steepest declines among those under 35. Meanwhile, since 2020, institutional investors have purchased over 35% of single-family homes that hit the market in major metropolitan areas. For anyone living in Phoenix, Atlanta, or Charlotte, the transformation is impossible to miss. Nearly 1 in 3 homes in some neighborhoods are now owned by Wall Street firms and investment vehicles, often paying 20 to 50% above asking price to outbid individual families. BlackRock, Invitation Homes, and other institutional investors now control over 300,000 single-family rentals across the fastest-growing cities. But here's where things get even more concerning. These same investment giants received unprecedented Federal Reserve support during the 2020 financial interventions, effectively accessing billions in near-zero interest loans unavailable to average citizens. They then used this cheap capital to buy up housing at scale, creating artificial scarcity that drives up both property values and rents. The manufacturing sector tells a similar story worldwide. The U.S. has lost nearly 7 million manufacturing jobs since 1979, with over 60,000 factories closing just since 2001. Meanwhile, foreign ownership of industrial capacity has reached record levels across Western nations. Perhaps most concerning are the parallels in land ownership. Foreign investors now control over 40 million acres of American farmland, an area roughly the size of Florida. Chinese firms alone have increased their holdings by 405% since 2010. But isn't this just the free market at work? How when you look behind the curtain? In 2023, Congress had the opportunity to restrict foreign purchases of farmland near military installations. Instead, they expanded loopholes, allowing continued acquisition through complex corporate structures. This isn't incompetence. It's by design. Federal Reserve pilot programs for a digital dollar mirror developments in Britain and Australia, creating the framework for programmable money that can be restricted based on social policies or political positions, all while wealth concentration has reached levels not seen since the 1920s, with the top 1% now controlling more wealth than the bottom 90% combined in many Western nations. What makes this transformation so insidious is the illusion of democratic choice. Both major political parties in all these countries, despite their rhetorical differences, have implemented virtually identical policies around housing, immigration, financialization, and foreign investment when in power. Voters on the left blame the right for deregulation that empowers Wall Street. Voters on the right blame the left for immigration policies that drive housing demand. Meanwhile, The actual policy framework enabling managed decline continues regardless of who holds office. This manufactured division is precisely the point. By keeping populations focused on cultural battles and partisan identities, the fundamental economic restructuring continues unnoticed. As the Roman poet Juvenal observed 2,000 years ago, give them bread and circuses and they will never revolt. Swiss economist Ernst Wolff offers a compelling explanation for what we're witnessing globally. He calls it the Great Taking, a systematic transfer of real assets from middle-class citizens to a concentrated few before an engineered financial crisis. The pattern is remarkably consistent across Western democracies. First, create asset bubbles through loose monetary policy. Then enable massive institutional buying of real assets. Next, implement digital currencies and financial controls. The fourth step appears to be triggering a controlled economic crisis. And finally, consolidate ownership through foreclosures and bankruptcies. We've already witnessed the first three stages playing out. The fourth appears increasingly imminent as central banks worldwide signal major monetary shifts, preparing the stage for what the World Economic Forum openly describes as the Great Reset. The uncomfortable truth is that nations failing to provide futures for their citizens have already sealed their fates. When managed decline becomes official policy, whether stated openly or pursued covertly, the social contract fundamental to Western democracy breaks down entirely. Like Rome, these modern nations won't collapse overnight, but will face prolonged deterioration while maintaining a facade of normalcy. The signs are already unmistakable throughout the Western world: declining birth rates, exodus of talent, and erosion of social cohesion. This isn't just about faraway countries. It's a global pattern affecting people everywhere. When major investment firms purchase entire neighborhoods, when manufacturing jobs vanish despite campaign promises, when foreign entities buy up farmland and critical infrastructure, you're seeing managed decline in action. The question isn't whether Canada, the UK, and Australia can recover their former prosperity. It's whether citizens worldwide will recognize the orchestrated nature of economic transformation before it's too late to change course. The Western world stands at a crossroads. The same policies that destroyed middle-class prosperity in these three countries are being implemented worldwide with frightening speed. Home prices have doubled in 15 years while real wages have stagnated. Manufacturing has been systematically offshored. Foreign ownership of farmland, real estate, and critical infrastructure is at record highs in country after country. Even the cultural engineering tactics are identical: divide the population, criminalize dissent, and promote a new normal where you'll own nothing and be happy. What we're witnessing isn't just economic restructuring. It's the deliberate dismantling of societies built on middle-class prosperity, replaced with a new feudalism where owning nothing is celebrated as freedom. If you found this video eye-opening, make sure to like and subscribe for more hard-hitting analysis. The mainstream media won't touch these topics, but we believe you deserve to know the truth about what's really happening to these once great nations. What do you think? Is the collapse of Canada, UK, and Australia really happening by design, or is this just coincidence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, check out China's Collapse into Poverty is Worse Than You Think right here. Don't forget to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our upcoming videos. Thanks for watching.
Every empire falls. That's what history says. Rome, Britain, the Soviets, even today, China and Russia are already cracking, and Europe isn't far behind. But what if one country refuses to collapse? What if the last superpower standing isn't just surviving, but thriving? In this video, we'll break down why America may be the only global power left standing by the end of this century, and how geography, tech, and sheer demographic force might make the US the final empire. Not because it's perfect, but because the rest are falling apart faster than anyone imagined. History feels like an endless, inescapable cycle, like we're all hamsters stuck on a wheel we can't control, even though we're supposed to be a lot smarter than hamsters. Empires rise, can't expand anymore, and collapse under their own weight as corruption and incompetence corrode their foundation from within. And now, a few people think the United States is on its way to join them. It just feels right. An overstretched military, a colossal debt, political paralysis at home that's now starting to prevent the government from even staying open? The shoe fits, especially when the US just hit a grim statistic. But maybe it doesn't fit. What if history is wrong this time? That's what everyone's hoping for. But to find out if it's just a fool's hope, we need to see when history is right. That's not too hard. Rome expanded rapidly and then couldn't afford to defend all that territory over centuries, especially when corruption and chaos tore it apart from within. The British Empire once covered a quarter of the globe. Then, it couldn't afford to keep its far-flung territories after the World Wars. Most recently, the Soviet Union shocked the world by falling to pieces almost overnight. And history didn't stop in 1991. We're seeing that pattern play out right now in the country that everybody said the 21st century would belong to, with a twist. Sometimes superpowers don't even need to suffer disaster on the battlefield. All their enemies need to do is wait for the clock to tick down. People were saying that the 21st century would be China's. It isn't hard to see why, with an economy that routinely grew by double digits every year. But the fertility rate wasn't growing with it. Just the opposite. Women tend to have fewer children when there's more wealth to go around. That's been the case as far back as ancient Rome, when the Emperor Augustus struggled to convince Roman women to have more babies. But you could at least say he tried. China's communist rulers did the opposite with the one-child policy. And lifting it didn't stop the trend. China's fertility rate fell to 1 child per woman in 2023. That's about the same or even lower than Japan. That's why China is aging faster than any major power. Right now, the median age is 40.1. But by 2049, the year it's supposed to be the world's strongest country if Xi Jinping has his way, it'll be 51.9. Good luck trying to compete with the US military with a recruitment pool that's grayer than the sky during a storm. But it gets worse, because geography's given China a bad hand to begin with. Go south to the Strait of Malacca. 80% of China's imported oil comes through this narrow channel. That's oh so easy to blockade. China might have 14,500 kilometers of coastline, but not all coastline is created equal. Since China's coast doesn't give it access to the world's oceans, it's of limited value for an aspiring superpower. China might have expanded at a breakneck pace, but now starting to show signs of strain as its economy slows. Debts pile up, and corruption plagues the ruling Communist Party, even as Xi was supposed to clean it up. Oh, and what's it supposed to do about all those ghost cities? Every day, China looks less like a superpower in waiting and more like a collapsing one, before it ever gets to where it was supposed to be. And China's so-called unlimited strategic partner is doing even worse. To discover Russia's problems, and another case of imperial collapse, let's take another trip back in time. In 1808, Napoleon was at the height of his power. Then he decided to invade Spain. The Peninsular War was a slow and brutal bleed of French power. The people at the time called it Napoleon's ulcer. That's kind of like what China is suffering through right now. Fortunately, without the bloodshed. Then, in 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia. And that was an even worse disaster. 600,000 troops went triumphantly into the east, ready to beat the Russians on their own turf. You know how that turned out. Fewer than 100,000 made it out. At best, that was Napoleon's hemorrhage, and Vladimir Putin decided to follow the example. Here's a stat that will shock you. Start by thinking about it. How many wars has Russia been in? Probably a lot more than you can count. Not because you can't do math, but because you won't be able to name them all. Russia's fought a lot more wars than the current one, and longer ones too. But now the war in Ukraine is the third deadliest in its history. Between 200,000 and 250,000 Russian men have died far from home, and over 1 million have become casualties. And the wars had knockoff effects. Even before the end of 2022, about 400,000 men left the country to avoid being drafted. These aren't just ordinary people either. They're among Russia's most productive. They're technology workers, businessmen, people with college degrees. Now they're trying to find employment overseas rather than enriching Russia's economy. These are people that won't be replaced, at least not anytime soon. Russia's fertility rate is a little better than China's. It's actually even gone up since the war started. In 2024 and 2025, it's been 1.83 children per woman. Xi is probably a little jealous of his best buddy, at least here. But that's still not enough to rejuvenate Russia from the losses it's suffering. Sometimes empires fall because they suffer catastrophic, irreversible military defeats. France used to be the dominant power on the European continent and had a sprawling colonial empire. But Britain steadily imposed its will as the 18th century unfolded. The War of the Spanish Succession started the trend. France's great Louis XIV was humbled. Then the 7 Years' War defeated France abroad. So by the time Napoleon came around, the balance of power had already changed. Britain was prepared to outlast and ultimately defeat him. And it did. And France was never the same again, at least not in the race between great powers. History rhymes. Russia's been clawing territory away from Ukraine, but at a cost it can't afford. In the big picture, this war is a defeat, no matter how much Putin tries to say otherwise. And you guessed it, corruption at home led to a lot of those disasters. Russian troops have been hard-pressed even to get body armor because officers saw black market sales as a way to make a quick buck. A quick victory over Ukraine was supposed to rejuvenate Russia from its post-Soviet fall. Instead of making it a superpower again, it's accelerated Russia's irrelevance. There's another big irony about the war in Ukraine. For centuries, Russia has expanded its borders to prevent an invasion. In the modern world, those enemies have been in the West, in Europe. The Soviet Union's end in 1981 meant that Russia's borders were wide open to an attack, all thanks to the European plain that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Urals, getting wider the further east it goes. The invasion of Ukraine was supposed to narrow that gap a little bit, just not as little as it's actually done. But if Putin thought harder about it, he wouldn't have needed to go with such a costly security strategy, because Europe is weaker now than it's been at any point since the 15th century. Europe got really rich and powerful as it explored the world and planted colonies in far-off lands. The British Empire alone controlled a quarter of the world's landmass. Almost the entire continents of Africa and Asia were under the control of one European power or another by the early 20th century. But the World War shattered all of that. Europe was left militarily and financially decimated, deep in debt to the former colony called the United States. For a while, Europe tried to stay in the mix. Countries like Britain and France held on to some of their colonies for a while, but it was useless. They just couldn't afford to keep them. Europe did eventually recover from the wars, but too late to keep its place as the world's center. In 2024, Europe made up only 24.7% of the world's GDP. That's a fair share, but it's far behind North America's 30.9% and Asia's 36.4%. What was once the center of the world economy is increasingly a secondary player. And how's this for another stat that proves it? In 2008, the United States and European Union had economies that were about equal in size. Actually, the EU was slightly in the lead, with a GDP 110% the size of the US. Then came the Great Recession, and one bounced back far better than the other. Between 2008 and 2023, the EU's economy grew by 13.5%, from 16.37 trillion to 18.59 trillion. The US? It grew by 87%, from 14.77 to 27.72 trillion. And the gap is even worse when you look at the GDP per capita. In 2008, Europe's GDP per capita was 76.5% of America's level. In 2023, it was 50%. What happened? Well, Brexit did. But that's not the only thing. It's hard to be productive when your workforce is getting old, fast. It's not quite as bad as China, but still pretty bad. In 2023, the EU's total fertility rate was 1.38 children per woman. That's way below the replacement, and it gets worse when you take a tour of Europe and look at how fast the gray hairs are multiplying in its biggest economies. France is doing comparatively okay at a rate of 1.66, Poland 1.16, Spain 1.12, Italy 1.20, and the biggest of all, Germany, is stuck at 1.39. That means only one thing. The EU's current median age of 44.7 is going to shoot up faster than the rockets Americans are used to seeing on the 4th of July. By 2050, over half the people in Europe will be pushing 50. That means fewer workers, less tax revenue, and overburdened healthcare systems. Europe tried to solve the problem with immigration, but despite record levels in the last 10 years, the continent's median age still went up by 2.2 years between 2014 and 2024. Europe also just isn't all that good at integrating immigrants, so it's also brought a host of other issues. That's a whole different can of worms. But Brexit was just one of the consequences. Check out our recent video about the tense situation in Britain if you want to find out more. And please consider subscribing to the channel while you're at it. It really helps us to go through the problems you won't see reported on your nightly news broadcast. Anyway, Europe's graying population means it has the same problems China has. How's it supposed to recruit soldiers when half the population is already heading for retirement? It'll have a real problem reversing decades of lackluster military readiness. Putin's so-called special military operation in Ukraine jolted Europe into finally trying to meet NATO's 2% benchmark for defense spending. But in 2024, the EU's defense expenditures were still only a collective 1.9%. It's progress, but Europe still depends on the United States for its security, and that's probably not going to change for a long time. Could be a bad situation if the United States is supposed to fall from superpower status. But people don't talk about American exceptionalism for nothing. Head across the Atlantic and you'll notice something. It's a wide ocean, and it's the first secret to American exceptionalism. The United States has an even wider ocean to the west, and that's the second secret. The closest example would be Britain at the height of its power, where it had the English Channel to guard against invasion and the Royal Navy to rule the waves. It worked really well, but it fell short once air power became a thing in the world wars. But even in this age of air power, a raid on the United States is unthinkable. It takes a lot of fuel to cross an ocean, and no one else has the refueling tankers to get their aircraft across those oceans in numbers. In 2024, the United States had 606 refueling tankers, 75% of the world's total. Russia, third in the world with 19. China didn't even make the top 5. Sure, the oceans don't protect the United States as well from intercontinental ballistic missiles. Russia and China have ICBMs that can hit the contiguous United States. But they'd have to think really hard about it since they'd get hit back. The geographical advantage remains. Nowhere in history has a great power been so well protected from rivals by its position. And the United States? It can use its military against any target in the world within a day, all without risking the use of its ICBMs. That's because America has a sprawling network of allies and partners. NATO is just the tip of the iceberg. The United States has at least 128 bases across 49 countries around the world. Over 170,000 troops are deployed overseas at any given time. It's a vast logistical forward operating network, and it gives the United States the ultimate advantage. It can hit at its enemies, while its enemies can't cross the oceans to hit it. We'll put it bluntly, no other superpower ever had such a cheat code. But you don't have to go overseas to find the only cheat code in the game of empires. Just look at a chart of the United States compared to the places people used to say could become a superpower. China, Russia, Europe, you know their demographic problems now. Across the oceans, the United States is the only major power whose population is still growing. By 2050, the median age in America will be 41.9. Not fantastic, but far better than China's 51.9. Ironically, the American fertility rate hit a record low of 1.59 in 2024. That's lower than Russia's and not much better than Germany's. But the United States sees about 1 million new legal immigrants arrive every year. and that's helping to keep the population pyramid from becoming the upside-down basket case it's becoming in China. That means more productivity, more soldiers, and less of a national income spent on pensions and health care. Those immigrants aren't the ones sneaking over the southern border. The ones that come in legally are often there to go to America's world-class universities, which prepare them to contribute to the national economy. Just look at the trend. In 2000, only 16.4% of America's STEM workforce was foreign-born. In 2019, it was 23.1%. That's because the United States is still the place to be to start a business or a family. Its tech sector leads the world despite increased competition from China. True, monitors like the Insect Group think that China's AI models are only a few months behind America's. And China produces half the world's AI researchers, compared to 18% from the United States. But it's all about the money, and America can make it rain. America still dwarfs China in private AI investment, $67.2 billion in 2023, compared to its rival of $7.8 billion. That's because of America's second secret weapon. It has a culture of innovation and entrepreneurship that China can't match. Because in China, especially Xi Jinping's China, everything has to conform to the glories of socialism. And China isn't exactly a place that's set to attract the world's top talent. America can combine immigration and innovation to produce the best results in ways its rivals can't. It's better at integration than Europe is. That's part of why Europe is growing regulations more than it's growing its economy. America's success isn't just luck, it's because of its constitutional architecture. As others falter, it only becomes more obvious. But it's not all smooth sailing for the United States. There's no guarantee it'll stay on top. Historically high immigration levels are doing more than growing its population. It's growing housing costs too, and helping to polarize America's politics. Its democratic institutions continue to function, but increasingly on shaky ground. Case in point, the federal government is having a hard time even staying open. Between 1980 and 1996, there were 6 government shutdowns lasting a combined 30 days. Between 2013 and 2025, there were 4 and they're lasting longer, a combined 67 days, and counting as of October 13th. And the shutdowns are a sign. Here's that statistic we talked about at the beginning. Since the United States is having trouble paying its bills, it's staring off a precipice it doesn't want to look down on. In 2024, the United States spent more on debt service than on defense, $1.01 trillion compared to $907.7 billion. It's been called the Ferguson limit, after the economic historian Niall Ferguson. Want to know why superpowers collapse? According to him, this is a sure-shot mark. Any great power that spends more on debt service than on defense will not stay great very long. True of Habsburg Spain, true of ancient regime France, true of the Ottoman Empire, true of the British Empire. This law is about to be put to the test by the U.S. beginning this very year. And with America's 2 political parties seemingly more eager to argue about transgender bathrooms than address issues like this, it's better for fundraising, you might be forgiven for thinking the country is already in decline. But there's one more secret weapon. The U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. Investors want to go into the U.S. economy because for all the reasons we've gone over, it's still the surest thing. That was something those other superpowers didn't have, and it's something that China doesn't have now. That means that for all its problems, the United States can still confidently plan to return people to the moon by 2028, while China is more limited on planning what to do with all its ghost cities. But do you think America is truly exceptional? Or will its power decline along with its rivals and every other superpower before it? Don't forget to let us know in the comments.
China is facing disaster, not in some distant future, right now. For decades, we've heard about China's unstoppable rise, the economic miracle, the superpower in waiting, the country that's supposedly eating America's lunch while we argue on social media. But behind the gleaming skyscrapers lies a nation on the brink. What we're about to show you in this video will absolutely blow your mind, because the truth about China is far more shocking than anything you've been told.
50 million empty apartments threaten to wipe out the life savings of hundreds of millions of Chinese families. China imports 85% of its soybeans and could face mass starvation if those imports were cut off. The Chinese government destroyed its own tech industry, wiping out $1.5 trillion in market value overnight. And China's military, despite its massive size and budget, has a fatal flaw that makes it far weaker than it appears. And we're just getting started. As China's problems multiply, this weakness becomes increasingly dangerous for global stability. The signs of collapse are everywhere if you know where to look. Let's dive in with the most visible crisis that's already sending shockwaves through China's economy. 1. Real estate apocalypse. China's economy is built on the largest real estate bubble in human history, and it's imploding right now. An astonishing 70% of Chinese household wealth is tied to real estate, according to the People's Bank of China, compared to just 25% in the U.S. Housing prices have fallen for 28 consecutive months, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, with no bottom in sight. The scale is mind-boggling. 60 to 80 million empty apartments as of August 2023, enough to house the entire population of Spain, sit unsold across the country. That's approximately $13 trillion of housing inventory going nowhere, according to Rogoff and Yang's research published in the American Economic Review. Major developers like Evergrande have collapsed, defaulting on over $300 billion in debt. Ghost cities stand half-finished, concrete skeletons abandoned mid-construction looking like something out of The Walking Dead. The situation has become so dire that homeowners have started mortgage boycotts, refusing to pay for homes that will never be completed. Over 400 stalled projects across 86 cities have seen payment strikes, according to researchers at the University of Hong Kong. When millions of families realize their life savings are evaporating, social unrest will follow, and it's already beginning. But what's happening with housing is just the tip of the iceberg. The debt situation beneath the surface is beyond comprehension. 2. Mountains of debt. China's debt-to-GDP ratio has soared to a staggering 345%, according to the Institute of International Finance, significantly worse than the United States, 123%, or Japan, 266%. Every year, China prints more fake growth to keep the economy afloat, but the debt is piling up faster than the economy is growing. It's like watching someone dig a hole to get out of a hole. The numbers will shock you. According to the Bank for International Settlements, China added $45 trillion in debt since 2008, equivalent to creating an economy the size of Germany every 2 years, but all on borrowed money. The game works like this. When the economy slows, the government orders banks to lend more money to build more things, mostly unnecessary infrastructure and empty housing. This creates jobs and boosts GDP statistics temporarily, but saddles the country with ever-increasing debt. It's like using one credit card to pay off another. It works until it doesn't. And when it finally stops working, the collapse will be spectacular. What's happening at the local level is even more alarming than the national crisis. 3. Local governments are bankrupt. China's local governments owe over $12.3 trillion, according to Goldman Sachs, and they've run out of ways to pay it back. For years, these governments relied on selling land to developers. But with the real estate market collapsing, that revenue stream has dried up. Land sales revenue plummeted by 38% in 2023, according to China's Ministry of Finance, the largest drop in a decade. The results are catastrophic. Cities can't pay salaries. Hospitals are running out of cash. In Hainan province, government workers have seen their salaries cut by 50%. In others, public servants are being paid in groceries instead of money. The numbers are staggering. Local governments spent approximately $1.3 trillion on zero-COVID measures in 2022 alone, according to the Financial Times. Money they simply didn't have. They're now sitting on debt equal to 76% of China's entire GDP. So where do desperate local governments turn when they need cash? To banks, of course. but China's banking system is hiding a secret that will leave you speechless. 4. Banking crisis. China's banks are sitting on a powder keg of bad loans that threatens to detonate the entire financial system. According to the Bank for International Settlements, non-performing loans in China are actually closer to 20% of GDP, about 10 times what official figures admit. That's $3.8 trillion in loans that will never be repaid, enough to bankrupt the entire banking system several times over. Meanwhile, legitimate small businesses can't access capital. The system is designed to keep the facade intact, not to create actual growth. Bank runs have already started in smaller regional banks. In Henan province, depositors found their life savings frozen, prompting rare public protests. When they tried to withdraw their money, their health QR codes mysteriously turned red, preventing them from traveling to bank branches. This might sound like conspiracy theory stuff, but it actually happened. The government literally used COVID tracking apps to stop people from withdrawing their money. If that doesn't terrify you, nothing will. People are losing faith in the system. When trust in banks evaporates, the financial system collapses. But there's an even more fundamental crisis threatening China's future. The country itself is disappearing at an alarming rate. 5. Population collapse. China's birth rate has fallen to a record low of 6.39 births per 1,000 people, according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, less than half the rate needed for population replacement. Despite abandoning the one-child policy, young Chinese couples simply aren't having babies. Housing costs are too high, education is too expensive, and work pressure is too intense. The truth is shocking. China's population declined by 1.39 million people in 2024 alone, marking the third consecutive year of decline, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. The rate of decline is accelerating, driven by the lasting effects of the one-child policy and rising economic pressures on families. By 2100, China's population could shrink to around 633 million, according to UN projections, less than half its current size. A shrinking population means fewer consumers, fewer workers, and fewer innovators. No economy can grow long-term with a rapidly declining population. It's basic math. And here's where things get truly terrifying. This population collapse isn't just a future problem. China's workforce is already vanishing at a rate that defies belief. 6. China's workforce collapse. China's working-age population peaked at 997 million in 2014 and has been shrinking ever since, according to Statista. By 2050, China will have 217 million fewer workers, according to the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, a drop larger than the entire U.S. workforce. By 2050, China will have more retirees than the entire population of the United States. These aren't projections from Western think tanks with an agenda. These are China's own numbers. China is facing the prospect of getting old before it gets rich, a demographic trap no major economy has successfully escaped. It's like trying to save for retirement after you've already retired. The most devastating part? The workforce collapse is hitting just as youth unemployment reaches crisis levels. 7. Unemployment nightmare. China's youth unemployment hit a staggering 21.3% in June 2024, according to Trading Economics. The situation became so embarrassing that Beijing simply stopped publishing the numbers. Tens of millions of college graduates can't find jobs matching their education. They've coined a term for themselves, full-time children, moving back in with parents after failing to launch careers. The numbers are jaw-dropping. In 2023, China produced 11.6 million college graduates, according to China's Ministry of Education. At current unemployment rates, about 2.5 million of them are jobless, creating a dangerous pool of educated, ambitious, and deeply frustrated young people. Throughout history, unemployed youth have been the kindling for political upheaval. The Arab Spring didn't start with middle-aged people complaining about politics. It started with young, educated people who couldn't find jobs. The social contract in China has always been simple: sacrifice political freedom for economic opportunity. But what happens when that economic opportunity disappears? The answer will reshape global politics for decades. But the worst part is yet to come. With so many unemployed young people, you'd expect China's manufacturing sector to be thriving. Instead, something unprecedented is happening that's sending shockwaves through the global economy. 8. Factories are leaving China. China was the world's factory, but companies are fleeing in droves at a pace that's hard to comprehend. Apple is aggressively shifting iPhone production to India, with plans to produce 25% of all iPhones in India by 2025, according to JP Morgan. Nike and Adidas have moved much of their manufacturing to Vietnam. U.S. imports from China dropped by 22% between 2022 and 2024, according to U.S. Census Bureau data. This exodus is happening for multiple reasons: rising labor costs as China's workforce shrinks, increasing government interference in business operations, growing fears about a potential conflict over Taiwan that could disrupt supply chains overnight. The numbers are brutal. Foreign direct investment in China plunged 80% in 2023, according to the State Administration of Foreign Exchange, reaching its lowest level since the 1990s. This isn't a blip. It's the beginning of a fundamental restructuring of global supply chains away from China. Once a company leaves, it rarely comes back. Each factory that relocates represents not just current job losses, but future opportunities that China will never see. The World Factory label made China rich. Losing it will make China poor. But that's nothing compared to what China did to its own tech sector. What comes next will make your jaw drop. 9. Tech collapse. For years, China's tech sector rivaled Silicon Valley. Companies like Alibaba, Tencent, and ByteDance appeared unstoppable. Then the government destroyed them in what might be the most spectacular act of economic self-sabotage in modern history. Xi Jinping feared tech giants had too much power, so he launched a brutal crackdown that wiped out over $1.5 trillion in market value from Chinese tech companies, according to Bloomberg. That's the equivalent of erasing the entire economies of Australia and New Zealand combined, overnight. Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, vanished for months after criticizing government regulators. When he reappeared, his company was being dismantled. The gaming industry lost billions after strict regulations limited playing time for minors and froze new game approvals. China's AI and semiconductor development has been crippled by U.S. export controls. Despite pouring $50 billion into chip manufacturing, China remains 5 to 7 years behind Taiwan and the U.S., according to the Semiconductor Industry Association. In 2021, China ranked number 1 globally in tech IPOs. By 2023, Chinese tech IPOs had plunged 87%, according to data from Refinitiv. You can build the tech sector in decades, but you can destroy one in months. But all these economic problems pale in comparison to a much more fundamental threat, one that's literally drying up before our eyes. 10. Water crisis. China is running out of water, and the consequences are more severe than anyone wants to admit. According to China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment, 86% of groundwater in major agricultural regions is polluted, much of it too contaminated for any use. The Yellow River, which supports 160 million people, is drying up, losing 15% of its flow since the 1990s, according to research published in the Journal of Hydrology. The North China Plain, home to 400 million people, faces such severe water shortages that the World Resources Institute identifies it as one of the most water-stressed regions on Earth. Water tables are dropping by 3 feet per year, according to research published in Nature. Without water, China's farms and factories will grind to a halt. Cities will become unlivable. You can print money, but you can't print rainfall. The numbers are staggering. China has 20% of the world's population, but only 7% of its fresh water. 12 of China's 23 provinces face extreme water stress, according to the World Resources Institute. This isn't just an environmental issue. It's an existential threat to China's survival as a unified nation. and it leads directly to perhaps the most shocking vulnerability in China's entire system. 11. China can't feed itself. Despite all its economic power, China has a deadly secret. It cannot feed its own people. The country imports 85% of its soybeans according to the USDA, 15% of its rice, and depends heavily on foreign food to survive. If a war, pandemic, or climate disaster disrupts these imports, China faces mass food shortages that would make empty grocery shelves during COVID look like a minor inconvenience. China's food imports have skyrocketed 1,000% since 2000 according to UN Comtrade data. The country spent $140 billion on imported food in 2023 alone, more than any other nation on Earth. Food security isn't just an economic issue, it's existential. Throughout Chinese history, dynasties have fallen when they've failed to feed the population. The Chinese Communist Party knows this well. It rose to power during a period of widespread hunger. A country that can't feed itself is perpetually vulnerable. No matter how many aircraft carriers China builds, it can't escape this basic reality. You can't eat aircraft carriers. And speaking of vulnerabilities, there's another resource crisis that keeps Chinese leaders awake at night. 12. Energy dependence. China depends heavily on foreign energy in ways that create critical strategic weaknesses. The country imports 73% of its oil according to China's National Bureau of Statistics, much of it through sea lanes that could be easily disrupted in a conflict. China's Strategic Petroleum Reserve can only cover about 80 days of imports according to the International Energy Agency, well below the 90-day minimum recommended for energy security. In a scenario where China faced a naval blockade, its economy would literally shut down within months. Factories would close, transportation would halt, cities would go dark. The numbers are alarming. China's oil import dependency has grown from 30% in 2000 to 73% today, according to China's National Energy Administration. Despite massive investments in renewable energy, China still gets 56% of its energy from coal, much of it imported. This vulnerability shapes China's military planning and foreign policy. It's why China has invested heavily in its navy and built artificial islands in the South China Sea. But the fundamental weakness remains. China needs energy imports to survive. All these economic and resource problems are creating something the Chinese government fears more than anything else. 13. Crime and social unrest. As economic pressures mount social stability, the Chinese government's highest priority is fraying in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. According to the China Labor Bulletin, protests and labor disputes increased by 30% in 2023 compared to 2022. Workers riot over unpaid wages. Homeowners demonstrate when their half-built apartments are abandoned. The middle class protest when their bank deposits are frozen. What's truly shocking, according to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, China spends $216 billion on internal security compared to $209 billion on its military. That's right, China spends more money controlling its own people than it does preparing for external threats. In Xinjiang province alone, China has detained over 1 million Uyghurs, according to UN estimates. Ethnic tensions simmer beneath the surface in Tibet, Inner Mongolia, and other regions. The social contract that maintained stability for decades, economic growth in exchange for political compliance, is breaking down as the economy falters. And when that social contract fully dissolves, the consequences will reshape global politics. But China's problems aren't just domestic. Its ambitious plan to dominate the global economy is facing a catastrophic failure that will leave you stunned. 14. Belt and Road Failure. China's Belt and Road Initiative was supposed to be Xi Jinping's legacy, a global infrastructure network extending Chinese influence across continents. Instead, it's becoming a financial disaster of historic proportions. Partner countries are defaulting on Chinese loans, leaving China with trillions in unpaid debts, according to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The numbers are staggering. China has lent over $1 trillion to more than 150 countries, much of it to nations that can't possibly repay. Sri Lanka couldn't repay its loans and was forced to hand over a strategic port to China for 99 years. Pakistan, one of China's closest allies, has repeatedly asked to restructure its Chinese debt. Over 40% of Pakistan's external debt is owed to China, according to the World Bank. According to research from aid data, 42 countries now have debt exposure to China exceeding 10% of their GDP. Many of these loans were made with predatory terms, including collateral requirements that let China seize assets when countries default. What was meant to expand China's power has instead drained its resources and generated resentment. Belt and Road countries increasingly view China as a predatory lender, not a benevolent partner. But China's global strategy isn't the only thing failing. Its core economic engine, exports, is sputtering in ways that threaten the entire system. 15. Collapsing exports and trade war pressure. China's once booming exports are under unprecedented pressure from all sides. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, U.S. tariffs now cover 66.4% of Chinese imports, up from just 7.5% in 2018. The European Union has imposed anti-dumping duties on everything from electric vehicles to solar panels. India and Vietnam are rapidly replacing China in key manufacturing sectors. Vietnam's exports to the U.S. have grown by 180% since 2018, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. India has overtaken China as the world's fastest-growing major economy. China's trade surplus fell by 30% in the first half of 2024 compared to the same period in 2023, according to data from China's General Administration of Customs. Chinese exports to the U.S. have fallen from $540 billion in 2018 to $427 billion in 2023, according to the U.S. Census Bureau. China built its economy on exports. Now the world is moving on, and there's no plan B. But if all these economic, demographic, and resource problems weren't enough, China faces another threat that might be the most dangerous of all. 16. Xi Jinping's total control. Xi Jinping has eliminated rivals and consolidated more power than any Chinese leader since Mao Zedong, making China effectively a one-man dictatorship. This might sound like strength, but it's actually China's greatest vulnerability. When all decisions flow through one person, the system becomes brittle. Subordinates fear delivering bad news. Alternative viewpoints are suppressed. Reality itself becomes distorted as it travels up the chain of command. According to the Congressional Research Service, Xi holds at least 12 top leadership positions, giving him unprecedented control over the party, state, and military. He's extended his rule indefinitely, removing the term limits that ensured regular leadership transitions. The consequences are dire. Economic policy blunders like the tech crackdown and zero COVID devastated China's economy. According to the World Bank, zero COVID alone cost China $4 trillion in lost economic output, all because no one could tell Xi it wasn't working. But this creates a dangerous dynamic. When everything is your decision, everything is your fault. As China's problems multiply, there's no one left to blame but Xi himself. And now for perhaps the most surprising fact of all, one that completely contradicts China's carefully cultivated image as a military superpower. 17. Military failures. Despite its impressive military parades and growing defense budget, China's military has a fatal flaw. It has never fought a modern war. The People's Liberation Army hasn't engaged in large-scale combat since a brief border war with Vietnam in 1979, and that didn't go well for China. Today's PLA officers have risen through the ranks based on political loyalty, not battlefield experience. Corruption remains rampant in the military despite purges and crackdowns. According to a RAND Corporation study, paid promotions, embezzlement, and kickbacks from defense contractors continue to undermine readiness. In 2022 alone, more than 60 senior military officers were investigated for corruption, according to China's Central Military Commission. Chinese soldiers lack real combat experience and train in highly scripted exercises designed to look good for political leaders rather than develop actual fighting capabilities. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's annual report to Congress, China's military training remains focused on choreographed demonstrations rather than realistic combat scenarios. Even China's growing naval power, often cited as evidence of its rising threat, has never been tested in combat conditions. Building ships is one thing, operating them effectively under fire is quite another. This military inexperience becomes especially concerning when you consider how these other 16 crises might push China's leadership toward a conflict as a distraction from domestic problems. History shows that failing regimes often look outward for enemies when facing collapse at home, and rarely has a major power faced so many simultaneous crises as China does today. The cracks in China's facade aren't just appearing, they're spreading rapidly across every sector of society and economy. From ghost cities to rivers running dry, from banks hiding bad loans to factories fleeing overseas, these aren't isolated problems that can be fixed with a 5-year plan. The China we thought we knew, the economic juggernaut destined to overtake America, was built on unsustainable foundations. The real estate bubble, demographic collapse, debt crisis, water shortages, and technological setbacks aren't separate challenges. They're interconnected failures in a system that's reaching its breaking point. History teaches us that no economic miracle lasts forever. The Soviet Union appeared unstoppable until it collapsed virtually overnight. Japan seemed destined to dominate the global economy until its bubble burst in the 1990s. China's trajectory may prove no different, except the scale of its problems dwarfs anything we've seen before. The implications stretch far beyond China's borders. Global supply chains, financial markets, and geopolitical alignments would all be transformed by China's decline. The question isn't whether China faces serious problems, the evidence is overwhelming that it does. The real question is how rapidly these crises will accelerate, and what that means for global stability. What do you think? Which of these facts shocked you the most? Can China somehow overcome these challenges? Or are we witnessing the early stages of a historic collapse? Let us know in the comments below. Now go check out China's collapse into poverty is worse than you think, or click this other video instead. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn that notification bell on so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos.